Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The Red Kin. They're not dogs. The dogs are leaving human footprints in the snow, but only from the knees up. The voice belonged to Sergeant Morris, a 20-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces Search and Rescue Unit, and it was not the voice of a man who was surprised. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything, who had pulled bodies from frozen lakes and fallen climbers from crevasses, and lost children from blizzards that should have killed them 10 times over. But there was something in his tone now, a tremor that his partner had never heard before, a frequency of unease that spoke of a boundary crossed. "What do you mean, from the knees up?" Corporal Jensen asked, her breath fogging in the frigid air, her snow goggles fogged with condensation. She was kneeling beside the track, her gloved hand hovering over the indentation in the snow without touching it, as though she were afraid that contact might contaminate the evidence or trigger something that was better left undisturbed. "I mean exactly what I said," Morris replied, his own voice dropping to a whisper that was swallowed by the wind. "Look at the track. The front half is a paw print, canine, clear as day. But the back half, look at the back half, Jensen, that's a boot. That's a human foot complete with tread pattern." Jensen looked and she saw. The track was not like anything in her training. The leading edge was unmistakably a canine paw, 4 toe pads, and a central pad pressed into the snow with a weight distribution that spoke of a running gait. But the trailing edge, where the heel should have been, was something else entirely. It was the impression of a human foot, encased in what looked like a heavy boot, the tread pattern crisp and detailed despite the snow that had partially filled it. The two impressions were not separate. They were continuous, a single track that began as a paw and ended as a foot, the transition so smooth that it looked almost natural, almost inevitable. "This is a prank," Jensen said, but her voice was weak, and she did not sound convinced even to herself. "Someone's playing a joke. They're wearing some kind of costume or stilts or—" "In -40, Morris asked. "In whiteout conditions, 50 kilometers from the nearest settlement. Jensen, nobody's playing a prank out here. Nobody even knows we're here." "Then what is it?" Morris looked up from the track, his eyes scanning the horizon that was nothing but white on white, the boundary between sky and snow erased by the blowing drift. "I don't know," he said, "but I think we're about to find out, and I think we're not going to like it." 3 weeks earlier, the climate research station known as Outpost Polaris had been a place of ambition and optimism, a privately funded facility on the coast of Ellesmere Island, less than 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole. It was one of the most remote scientific installations in the world, accessible only by Twin Otter aircraft in summer and by Ski-Doo convoy across the sea ice in winter. It had been established by a consortium of European and North American universities, funded by a mix of government grants and corporate sponsorship, and staffed by a rotating team of researchers who were willing to endure isolation and danger in exchange for data that could not be collected anywhere else. The team consisted of 6 people, not counting the corporate surveyor who had been sent to oversee an expansion project. There was Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead climatologist, a woman in her 40s who had spent her career studying the methane emissions of thawing permafrost and who had a reputation for being both brilliant and difficult. There was Dr. James Whitfield, a glaciologist from Oxford who had never been to the Arctic before and who complained about the cold with a frequency that made his colleagues want to strangle him. There was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a microbiologist who had discovered 3 new species of extremophile bacteria in the station's first year, and who spoke so rarely that some of the support staff had never heard her voice. There were 2 graduate students, Marcus Holt, a master's candidate in atmospheric physics, and Priya Desai, a PhD student in paleoclimatology, who handled the day-to-day maintenance and data collection. And there was the corporate surveyor, a man named Victor Hale, who had arrived in November with a team of heavy equipment operators and a mandate to prepare the ground for a new drilling platform. The drilling was controversial. The consortium had approved it over the objections of several member institutions, arguing that core samples from the deep permafrost would provide invaluable data about past climate conditions. But the location that Hale had chosen for the platform was problematic. It lay in a valley that the local Inuit communities had identified, in their consultations with the territorial government, as a place of spiritual significance. The valley was marked by a series of stone markers, Inukshuit, that had been erected centuries earlier, perhaps millennia, by people who had understood something about the land that modern science had not yet discovered. The Inukshuit were not random. They were arranged in a specific pattern, a boundary line that stretched across the valley's mouth in a sequence of cairns and standing stones that looked almost like a wall from a distance. The Inuit elders had warned, in the translated testimony that had been provided to the consortium, that the markers served to keep something contained. Something they called the red kin. Something that was not animal and not human, but something in between. Something that had been born of a union that should never have occurred, and that had been confined to the valley by the ancient stones, and that must never be allowed to escape. Victor Hale had laughed at the warnings. He was a corporate man, a surveyor who had worked in oil and gas and mining for 30 years, who had drilled through sacred sites on 4 continents, and who had learned that the words spiritual significance were usually code for "we want more money." He had ordered the equipment operators to move the Inukshuit. Not destroy them, that would have been a public relations disaster, but relocate them, shift them 50 meters to the east, out of the drilling zone. The operators had complied because they were paid to comply, and because the warnings of Inuit elders seemed like quaint superstition in the face of modern machinery. The stones had been moved on November 3rd. By November 5th, the wildlife had vanished. It was Dr. Chen who noticed first. She had been making her daily rounds of the station's perimeter sensors, checking the cameras that monitored the local fauna, Arctic foxes, snowshoe hares, the occasional wolf or muskox, and she found that the cameras had recorded nothing for 48 hours. Not a single animal, not a bird, not even the ever-present ravens that were normally so bold they would steal food from the station's porch. "That's impossible," Whitfield had said, peering over her shoulder at the blank footage. "There are always animals. Even in the worst storms we get something, a lemming, a ptarmigan, something." "Not anymore," Chen said, her voice tight. "They're gone, all of them." They checked the other sensors. The seismic monitors, which usually picked up the movement of caribou herds in the valley beyond the station, showed nothing. The acoustic recorders, which captured the calls of owls and the howls of wolves, recorded only silence, a silence so absolute that it seemed to have weight, to press against the microphones with a physical force. Even the temperature sensors, which should have shown the subtle variations caused by the body heat of passing animals, registered only the steady, monotonous decline of the Arctic winter. "Migration," Marcus suggested, though his voice betrayed his doubt. "Maybe they sensed a storm coming and moved south." "In November," Priya asked, "everything should be settling in for winter, not migrating. And even if they were migrating, we'd see something, tracks, scat, signs. There's nothing. It's like the entire ecosystem just stopped." Victor Hale had dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand. "Animals move," he said. "That's what animals do. They'll be back when the weather settles. In the meantime, we have work to do. The drilling equipment arrives in 2 weeks, and I need that platform ready." He had walked away, his heavy boots crunching through the snow, and the scientists had exchanged glances that spoke of a shared unease that none of them was willing to articulate. The caribou was found on November 7th by one of the equipment operators who had gone to check a fuel line that ran from the station to the storage depot. It was lying in a snowbank 200 meters from the station's main building. its body arranged in a posture that was too deliberate to be natural. The head was twisted backward, the neck broken with a violence that suggested massive force. The chest had been torn open, not with claws or teeth but with something sharper, something that had separated the ribs with a precision that was almost surgical. And the organs, the heart, the lungs, the liver, were gone. Not eaten, removed. "Wolves," Hale said when he was shown the body. "Wolves got it." "Wolves don't do this," Dr. Chen said, kneeling beside the caribou with a coldness that was born of professional habit rather than emotional distance. "Wolves tear, they rip, they scatter the remains. This animal was opened with a blade or something like a blade, and the organs were removed intact. This is not predation. This is butchery." "Polar bear, then," Hale insisted. "A hungry bear late in the season, desperate for food." "A bear would have eaten the meat," Whitfield pointed out. "There's almost no flesh missing, just the organs, just the internal parts." They followed the tracks. They were there in the snow around the caribou, a trail that led away from the body and into the valley beyond the station. At first, the tracks were straightforward, canine, clearly canine, the paw prints of a large wolf or a small bear, pressed into the snow with a weight that suggested an animal of considerable size. But after 50 meters, the tracks began to change. The paw prints grew larger, the toe pads spread wider, and then, gradually, imperceptibly, the tracks began to show something else. An elongation of the heel, a narrowing of the toes, a pattern that was less canine and more something else. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered, his camera clicking as he documented each print. "These aren't wolf tracks, these aren't bear tracks, these are hybrid," Yuki said, and it was the first time she had spoken in 3 days. "They are changing, they are becoming something else." "Changing?" Hale laughed, but there was a strain in his voice now, a tension that had not been there before. "Tracks don't change. Animals don't change their tracks in the middle of a trail." "These do," Yuki said, and she pointed to the most recent print, the one that was freshest, the one that had been made within the last hour. "Look." They looked, and they saw what Morris and Jensen would see 3 weeks later, what would bring the search and rescue team to the valley, what would turn a routine check on a missing research station into a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The track was a paw print, but it was also a boot print. The front half was canine, 4 toe pads pressed into the snow with the weight of a running animal. The back half was human, a heavy boot with a tread pattern that matched the snow boots issued to the station's staff. The 2 impressions were continuous, a single track that began as one thing and ended as another, the transition so smooth that it looked almost natural. "This is impossible," Hale said, and for the first time since he had arrived at Outpost Polaris, he sounded like a man who was not entirely sure of himself. "No," Dr. Chen said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is not impossible. This is exactly what the elders warned us about. The red kin, the Adlet, the children of the dog woman." "Superstition," Hale snapped, but he took a step backward, away from the track, and his hand found the radio at his belt with a desperation that was almost comic. "Then explain it," Chen challenged. "Explain the tracks, explain the caribou, explain the silence." Hale could not explain it. None of them could. They returned to the station in a silence that was broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow, and they locked the doors behind them, and they waited. The waiting was the worst part. The sun had set in late October and would not rise again until February, leaving them in a perpetual twilight that was illuminated only by the stars and the aurora and the station's own lights. The wind howled around the buildings, a constant, keening sound that seemed to carry voices, messages, warnings that could not quite be understood. And the silence beyond the station's walls was absolute, a void where the normal sounds of the Arctic, the bark of foxes, the hoot of owls, the distant crash of ice, had been replaced by nothing. On November 8th, the first person disappeared. It was one of the equipment operators, a man named Henderson who had gone to check the fuel depot and had not returned. They found his jacket, torn and bloodied, lying in the snow 50 meters from the station. They found his radio, still functional, abandoned beside a snowbank. But they did not find him. Not his body, not his tracks, not any sign of what had taken him. "We need to evacuate," Whitfield said, his voice trembling. "We need to call for extraction, now." "The plane can't land in these conditions," Hale said, but his voice was hollow, and his eyes kept drifting to the window, to the darkness beyond, to the valley that was no longer just a valley but a doorway that had been opened by his own arrogance. "The runway's iced. We need to wait for a weather window." "We don't have a weather window," Priya said. "We have something out there that's hunting us, and we're sitting here waiting for it to come." "Then we fortify," Hale decided, and there was a desperate energy in his voice, a need to do something, anything that would restore his sense of control. "We lock the doors, we shutter the windows, we keep the generators running and the lights on. Whatever's out there, it doesn't like light, it doesn't like noise. We'll make this place a fortress." They tried. They worked through the night, boarding windows, reinforcing doors, checking weapons, 2 hunting rifles and a flare gun that had been stored in the equipment locker for emergencies. They organized watches, 2-hour shifts where one person stayed awake and monitored the cameras while the others tried to sleep. They huddled together in the station's common room, drinking coffee that was too strong and whiskey that was too weak, waiting for the dawn that would not come. And outside in the darkness, in the silence, something was watching, something was waiting, something was learning. On November 9th, the dogs began to howl. The station had 2 sled dogs, huskies named Balto and Togo, who had been brought along for emergency transport and who had spent most of their time sleeping in the equipment shed. Their howls were not the normal vocalizations of dogs communicating with each other or responding to distant sounds. They were screams. High-pitched, continuous, terrified screams that spoke of a fear so profound that it could not be expressed in any other way. Dr. Chen ran to the shed, her rifle in her hands, and found the dogs cowering in the corner, their bodies pressed against the wall, their eyes wide and rolling, their hackles raised in a ridge that ran from skull to tail. They were not looking at the door. They were looking at the wall, the interior wall that faced the valley. "What is it?" Chen whispered, though she knew the dogs could not answer. "What do you see?" The dogs whimpered. They whined. They pressed themselves harder against the wall, as though they were trying to push through it, to escape to the other side, to get away from whatever was on the other side of the wood. Chen raised her rifle and approached the wall. She pressed her ear against it, listening, and she heard something. A sound. A rhythm. A pattern of taps and scratches that was too regular to be random, too complex to be animal, too deliberate to be natural. It was Morse code. No, not Morse code. Something older. Something that predated human communication but had learned to imitate it. A sequence of sounds that was almost language, almost meaning, almost message. Tap, tap, scratch. Tap, tap, scratch. A rhythm that seemed to be saying something, asking something, demanding something. Chen stepped back from the wall, her rifle raised, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. "Identify yourself." The tapping stopped. For a moment there was only the wind and the dogs whining and the distant hum of the generators. Then the tapping resumed, but this time it was different. This time it was closer. This time it was not coming from the wall but from the door, from the main entrance of the station, from the other side of the reinforced steel that was supposed to keep them safe. Tap, tap, scratch, tap, tap, scratch. And then beneath the tapping, a sound that made Dr. Chen's blood run cold. A sound that was almost human, almost familiar, almost friendly. "Hello," a voice called. "Is anyone there? I'm hurt, please help me." It was Henderson's voice. Henderson, who had disappeared 2 days ago. Henderson, whose jacket had been found torn and bloodied in the snow. Henderson, who could not possibly be alive, who could not possibly be outside the station, who could not possibly be asking for help in a voice that was warm and human and utterly wrong. "It's not him," Whitfield whispered, appearing at Chen's shoulder, his face pale in the fluorescent light. "It can't be him." "Then who is it?" Chen asked. "It's them," Yuki said, and her voice was steady, almost calm, the voice of a woman who had accepted something that the others were still struggling to comprehend. "The Adlet. They have learned to mimic. They have learned to copy our voices. They are using Henderson to lure us out." "That's insane," Hale said, but his voice was weak, and he did not move toward the door. "Open the door," the voice outside said, and it was still Henderson's voice, still warm, still human, still wrong. "Please, I'm freezing. I need medical attention. Dr. Chen, please, it's me. It's Henderson." "Don't," Priya said, her voice barely audible. "Don't open it. Whatever's out there, it's not Henderson." "But what if it is?" Marcus asked, and there was a desperate hope in his voice that was more painful than despair. "What if he's alive? What if they didn't kill him? What if he's out there and he's dying and we're just sitting here?" "Then he dies," Yuki said flatly, "and we live. That is the choice." The tapping continued. The voice continued. It spoke their names one by one with a familiarity that was chilling. It spoke of shared memories, of inside jokes, of moments that only the real Henderson could have known. It wept. It begged. It promised that it was harmless, that it was alone, that it only needed shelter and warmth and a chance to explain. They did not open the door. And eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the tapping stopped. The voice stopped, and the silence returned, deeper and more absolute than before. But they knew with a certainty that would not leave them that the thing outside had not gone away. It had simply learned. It had learned that direct appeal did not work. It had learned that mimicry of a specific voice was not enough, and it would adapt. It would try something else, something worse. The siege had begun. And the Red Kin, who had been confined to the valley for centuries by the ancient stones that Victor Hale had moved, were now free. They were learning, they were hunting, and they were coming. The Arctic night closed in, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the station huddled in its pool of artificial light, a tiny island of warmth and sanity in a wilderness that was older and hungrier and more patient than any human could comprehend. The door was locked, the windows were boarded, the rifles were loaded. But the walls were thin, and the darkness was deep, and the Red Kin had all the time in the world. Second night was worse than the first. The first night had been defined by fear, by the raw animal terror of a group of people who had realized that they were not alone in the wilderness. But the second night was defined by something more subtle, more insidious, more profoundly disturbing. It was defined by the slow erosion of certainty, the gradual dissolution of the boundaries between the real and the imagined, the creeping suspicion that the world they had believed in was not the world they actually inhabited. They had spent the day fortifying the station, working in shifts to reinforce doors and shutter windows and check the perimeter cameras for any sign of movement. But the cameras showed nothing. The snow around the station was undisturbed, the drifts smooth and unbroken, the landscape a blank canvas of white that seemed to mock their paranoia with its emptiness. There were no tracks, no shadows, no signs that anything had approached the building during the hours of darkness. And yet they knew, with a certainty that transcended evidence, that they were being watched. "It's the silence," Whitfield said, over dinner that consisted of rehydrated stew and stale crackers. "The silence is wrong. The Arctic is never this quiet. Even in the depths of winter there are sounds, ice shifting, wind patterns, animals, but now there's nothing. It's like the entire valley has been wrapped in cotton wool." "They're absorbing the sound," Yuki said, and she was looking out the window at the darkness beyond, her eyes unfocused, her mind clearly elsewhere. "The Adlet, they hunt with sound, they communicate with sound, and they can cancel it. They can create zones of silence, like acoustic camouflage." "That's not possible," Hale said. but it was the 100th time he had said it, and the words were beginning to sound like a mantra, a prayer, a desperate attempt to hold back the tide of the impossible with the dike of the rational. "Nothing is impossible anymore," Dr. Chen said. She had not slept in 36 hours, and her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, but her voice was steady, almost clinical. "We need to accept that we are dealing with something outside our experience, something that does not follow the rules we understand, and we need to adapt." "Adapt how?" Marcus asked. "We can't call for help, the radio's dead." The radio had died sometime during the first night, not with a crackle of static or a gradual fade, but with a sudden, absolute silence that suggested deliberate interference rather than equipment failure. The satellite phone was no better, its signal blocked by something that was not atmospheric interference but something else, something that seemed to absorb electromagnetic radiation the way the snow absorbed sound. "We're cut off," Priya said, and her voice was small, almost childlike. "We're completely cut off." "Then we survive," Chen said. "We ration food, we conserve fuel, we maintain the generators, and we wait for the weather to clear enough for a visual signal, a flare, a fire, something that can be seen from the air." "And in the meantime," Whitfield asked, "what do we do about them?" "We study them," Chen said. "We observe, we document, we try to understand what we're dealing with, because the only way to survive a predator is to understand its behavior." It was Marcus who saw the scout. He was on watch, sitting in the monitoring station with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the bank of screens that showed the camera feeds from around the station. The cameras were infrared, designed to pick up heat signatures in the darkness, and for most of the night they had shown nothing but the uniform cold of the snow and the faint warmth of the station's own walls. And then at 3:17 a.m. a figure appeared on camera 4. It was 200 meters from the station, standing on a ridge of ice that had formed where the wind had sculpted the snow into a series of frozen waves. The figure was upright, bipedal, silhouetted against the sky with a posture that was almost human. But the proportions were wrong. The legs were too short, too heavily muscled, ending in feet that were splayed and clawed. The torso was long, almost canine in its proportions, with a chest that was deep and powerful and a waist that was narrow and flexible. The arms were long, longer than human arms, ending in hands that were not quite paws and not quite palms but something in between, with fingers that were tipped with claws that caught the infrared light and turned them into points of pale luminescence. And the head, God, the head. It was the most disturbing part. The head was not human and not canine but a nightmarish hybrid of both, a skull that was elongated like a wolf's but topped with a cranium that was large enough to suggest intelligence. The snout was long and toothy, but the eyes were forward-facing, binocular, human. They stared at the camera with an expression that was not animal curiosity but something else, something that made Marcus's skin crawl with a recognition that he could not name. "Dr. Chen," he whispered, his hand fumbling for the radio. "Dr. Chen, get in here, now." They watched it together, the 6 of them huddled around the monitor, their breath held, their hearts pounding. The creature, the Adlet, though Marcus could not bring himself to use the word, stood motionless on the ridge for nearly 10 minutes, its eyes fixed on the camera, its body held in a posture of perfect stillness that was more terrible than any movement could have been. And then it began to communicate. It started with a whistle, a single clear note that cut through the silence like a blade, rising and falling in a pattern that was almost musical. The whistle was answered, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the ridge, by a second whistle, and then a third, and then a chorus of sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. "My God," Whitfield breathed, "there are dozens of them." "More," Yuki said. "Hundreds, listen, the harmonics. Each whistle is a different frequency. They're not just communicating, they're encoding information like a biological internet." "What kind of information?" Hale asked. "Position, numbers, intent, everything." The scout on the ridge was not whistling anymore. It was tapping. Its claws, those terrible hybrid claws, were striking the ice in a rapid, rhythmic pattern that was too complex to be random. Tap, tap, scratch. Tap, scratch, tap, tap. A sequence that repeated, varied, returned, evolved. "It's Morse code," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "It's almost Morse code." "It's older than Morse code," Yuki said. "It's older than human language. It's a system that predates us by millennia, and they've learned to adapt it, to use it in ways that we can almost understand." "What are they saying?" Priya asked. Yuki was silent for a long moment, her head tilted, her eyes closed, her mind processing the patterns with a speed that seemed almost superhuman. "They're counting us," she said finally. "They're counting our numbers, our positions, our weaknesses, and they're discussing strategy." "Strategy?" Hale laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You mean like a military operation?" "Exactly like a military operation," Yuki said, and her eyes opened, and they were filled with a fear that was deeper than anything Marcus had seen before. "They're not just hunting us. They're hurting us. They're using sound to control our movement, to guide us where they want us to go." "Where do they want us to go?" Yuki looked at the map on the wall, the topographical chart that showed the valley and the station and the surrounding terrain. Her finger traced a path from the station to a point in the valley's center, a depression in the terrain that was sheltered from the wind and surrounded by high ground on 3 sides. "There," she said, "they want us there, a kill box, a place where the terrain works against us and for them." "Then we don't go," Chen said. "We stay here, we fortify, we wait." "We can't stay here forever," Whitfield pointed out. "We have limited food, limited fuel. If they wait us out, we starve or freeze." "Then we need to understand them," Chen said. "We need to find their weakness, their behavior, their social structure. If they're intelligent enough to coordinate, they're intelligent enough to have rules, hierarchy, leaders, and leaders can be targeted." They watched the scout for the rest of the night, taking shifts, documenting its movements, its communications, its behavior. It did not approach the station. It did not attack. It simply stood on the ridge, visible but untouchable, and communicated with its fellows in a continuous stream of whistles and taps that filled the darkness with a soundscape that was almost beautiful in its complexity. And then, just before dawn, it left. Not gradually, not fading into the distance, but suddenly, as though a signal had been given that the humans could not hear. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, leaving behind only the smooth snow and the silence and the lingering sense that they had been judged and found wanting. The second disappearance happened on the 3rd day. It was Whitfield. He had gone to the equipment shed to check the fuel levels, a task that should have taken 5 minutes, and he had not returned. They found the door of the shed open, swinging in the wind, and inside they found his clipboard, his gloves, and a single drop of blood on the concrete floor. "No tracks," Marcus reported after searching the perimeter. "No sign of struggle, no sounds, he just vanished." "They're taking us one by one," Priya said, her voice hollow. "They're isolating us, separating us, making us easier to handle." "We stay together," Chen ordered. "From now on, nobody goes anywhere alone. We move in pairs minimum, and we stay within sight of the station." But the rules did not help. On the 4th day, they found Whitfield. He was in the valley in the depression that Yuki had identified as the kill box, and he was not dead. Not exactly. His body was intact, his chest still rising and falling with shallow, irregular breaths. But he had been changed, altered, processed in a way that defied medical explanation. His clothes had been removed, folded neatly beside him, as though the Adlet had respected his modesty even as they violated his body. His skin had been marked with patterns of scratches, lines that ran from shoulder to hip in parallel rows that looked almost like measurements, almost like comparisons, and his abdomen had been opened. Not torn, opened, With a precision that was surgical, the Adlet had made an incision from sternum to pubis, retracting the skin and muscle to expose the organs beneath. The organs were still there, still functioning, still pulsing with blood and life, but they had been examined, touched, moved. The intestines had been lifted and placed beside the body, coiled like a rope. The liver had been palpated, its surface marked with claw tips that had left indentations in the tissue. The heart was still beating, visible through the gap in the ribs, and it too had been touched, pressed, assessed. "He's alive," Priya whispered, her medical training overriding her horror. "He's still alive. We need to close the wound. We need to." "Wait," Yuki said, and her voice was strange, distant, almost dreamy. "Look at the marks. Look at what they've done." They looked and they saw. The scratches on Whitfield's skin were not random. They were comparisons. Next to each scratch on Whitfield's body was a corresponding mark in the snow, a pattern of claw tips that matched the spacing and depth of the scratches. The Adlet had been comparing Whitfield's anatomy to their own. They had been measuring his torso against the torsos of their own bodies. They had been assessing the differences, cataloging the similarities, trying to understand what made him human and what made them something else. "They're studying us," Chen said, her voice barely audible. "They're not just eating us, they're trying to understand us." "No," Yuki said. "They're trying to understand themselves. They're trying to understand what they are, where they came from, why they exist." "What do you mean?" Yuki knelt beside Whitfield's body, her fingers hovering over the marks without touching them. "The Inuit legend," she said. "The story of the Adlet. A woman alone in the wilderness gave birth to 5 children. 4 were dogs, 1 was human. The dogs became the Adlet. The human became the first Inuit, but the Adlet were forever in between. Not fully animal, not fully human, forever alienated from both worlds." "That's a myth," Hale said. "A creation story." "Is it?" Yuki asked. "Look at these marks. Look at the care they've taken. They're not treating him like food. They're treating him like a relative, like a lost cousin, like someone who shares their blood but not their form." Whitfield's eyes fluttered open. He was conscious. Barely, but conscious. His lips moved, trying to form words, and Priya leaned close, her ear almost touching his mouth. They touched me," he whispered, his voice a thread of sound that was barely audible. "They touched me and they cried. They made sounds like weeping, like they were sorry, like they didn't want to hurt me but they had to, like it was their duty." "It's okay," Priya lied, her tears falling onto his face. "It's going to be okay. We're going to get you back to the station. We're going to fix you." But they couldn't fix him. The incision was too precise, the damage too controlled, the violation too complete. Whitfield's body was still alive, but something had been taken from him, something that was not physical but essential. His eyes, which had been sharp and intelligent, were now dull, vacant, the eyes of a man who had seen something that had burned out the part of him that was human. He died an hour later, not from blood loss or trauma, but from something that looked almost like surrender. His breathing slowed and stopped, and his body relaxed into the snow with a gentleness that was more terrible than any violence could have been. They buried him in the snow, because they could not carry him back to the station, and they could not leave him for the Adlet to process further. They covered him with rocks and marked the grave with his own snow boots, and they said words that were inadequate but necessary, and they returned to the station in a silence that was broken only by the wind. And that night the tapping began. It was not the scout this time. It was closer, much closer. The sound came from the walls of the station itself, from the plywood and insulation and steel siding that were all that separated them from the darkness. Tap, tap, scratch. Tap, scratch, tap, tap. A rhythm that was almost language, almost message, almost threat. "They're on the roof," Marcus said, looking up at the ceiling, his face pale in the lamplight. "I can hear them. They're walking on the roof." "How many?" Chen asked. "I don't know, 3, 4 more." The sounds continued. The walking, the tapping, the whistling. And then, beneath it all, a new sound. A sound that made them all freeze, that made their blood run cold, that made the station seem suddenly flimsy and inadequate. It was Whitfield's voice. "Hello," it said, coming from the roof, from the walls, from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Can anyone hear me? I'm cold, I'm so cold. Please let me in." "That's not him," Priya whispered, her hands pressed over her ears. "That's not him, he's dead, we buried him." "They learned his voice," Yuki said. "They learned his patterns, they're using him just like they used Henderson." "Why?" Hale asked, and his voice was broken, shattered, the voice of a man who had lost everything including his belief in the rational world. "Why are they doing this?" "Because they can," Yuki said. "Because they're learning. Because every time they mimic us, every time they copy our voices and our sounds and our behaviors, they become more like us, and more dangerous." The voice continued, Whitfield's voice, warm and human and utterly wrong. It spoke of memories that only Whitfield could have known. It spoke of fears that only Whitfield could have felt. It wept. It begged. It promised that it was harmless, that it was alone, that it only needed shelter and warmth and a chance to explain. They did not open the door. But they listened. They could not help but listen. And as they listened, they began to understand in a way that was deeper than conscious thought that the Adlet were not just hunting them. They were studying them. They were absorbing them. They were becoming them. And the more they became, the harder they would be to stop. The siege continued. The tapping continued. The voices continued. And the snow fell, and the wind blew, and the Arctic night closed in, and Outpost Polaris became a fortress under assault by an enemy that was not just outside the walls but inside their minds, wearing their faces, speaking with their voices, learning to be human with a speed that was both terrifying and tragic. The Red Kin were not monsters. They were something worse. They were mirrors. They were the reflection of everything that humanity was, distorted through the lens of an evolution that had taken a different path. They were the children of the dog woman, forever caught between two worlds, forever searching for the answer to a question that had no answer. What am I? And they were asking that question with claws and teeth and voices that wore the faces of the dead, and they would not stop until they had found an answer, or until there was no one left to ask. The fifth day brought a change in tactics, and the change was more terrifying than anything that had come before. They had assumed, based on their observations of the scout and the communications that had echoed through the darkness, that the Adlet were ground-dwelling creatures. They had assumed that the station's walls, its elevated position on a small rise above the valley floor, its solid construction and reinforced doors, would provide some measure of protection. They had assumed that as long as they stayed inside, stayed together, stayed alert, they would be safe. They were wrong. It was Priya who saw them first. She was on watch, sitting by the window that overlooked the eastern approach to the station, the side that faced the frozen river and the ice bridge that was their only potential route to the coast. She had been scanning the horizon with binoculars, looking for any sign of aircraft or rescue teams or the aurora that might signal a break in the weather. And she had seen movement on the wall. Not outside the wall, on the wall, climbing it. "Dr. Chen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Chen, come here now." Chen arrived at her shoulder, and together they watched as the Adlet scaled the exterior of the station with a grace that was almost supernatural. The creatures moved like spiders, their claws finding purchase on the plywood and insulation and steel siding, their bodies pressed flat against the surface, their limbs splayed in a posture that distributed their weight and allowed them to climb vertical surfaces that should have been impossible to ascend. There were 5 of them. No 6. No more. They kept appearing, materializing from the darkness below, their red-brown fur almost invisible against the weathered wood, their eyes reflecting the station's interior light in pairs of gleaming points that made them look like constellations of malevolent stars. "How are they doing that?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking. "How are they climbing like that?" "They're not climbing," Yuki said, and her voice was distant, analytical, the voice of a scientist observing a phenomenon rather than a human facing a nightmare. "They're adhering. Look at their feet. The pads. They're expanding, flattening, creating surface tension, like gecko feet, but scaled up, adapted for snow and ice and wood." "That's not possible," Hale said, but the words were automatic now, a reflex that no longer carried any conviction. "It is possible," Yuki said. "It is happening, and they are not just climbing the walls, they are moving across the roof." She was right. The Adlet had reached the roof line and they were not stopping. They were flowing over the edge, their bodies low and flat, their movements synchronized and deliberate, spreading across the station's roof like a living carpet. They were above them now, above and around and... "The ice bridge," Priya said, her binoculars dropping from her hands. "Oh God, the ice bridge." Chen grabbed the binoculars and scanned the frozen river. The ice bridge, a natural formation where the current slowed and the water froze into a solid span that connected the station's side of the river to the far bank, had been their only hope of escape. It was wide enough for walking, stable enough to bear weight, and it led to a trail that eventually connected to the coastal research station 30 kilometers away. They had not tried to cross it yet because the weather had been too severe, the visibility too poor, the risk of getting lost in the whiteout too great. But the ice bridge was no longer there. Not destroyed, not melted, but altered. The Adlet had been busy during the night while the humans huddled inside and listened to the tapping and the voices. They had dismantled the bridge. Not with tools but with their claws, their teeth, their relentless patience, they had separated the ice from the bank, carving a gap of open water that was 10 meters wide and impassable. The bridge still existed, but it was now an island, a platform of ice floating in the middle of the current, disconnected from both shores. "They've cut us off," Chen said, her voice flat, emotionless. "They've turned the outpost into a kill box." "We can still swim," Marcus said. "The water's cold, but if we're quick." "No," Yuki said. "Look." She pointed to the riverbank, to the place where the ice bridge had connected to the far shore. There were Adlet there, dozens of them, arranged in a line that stretched along the bank like sentinels. They were not moving. They were simply waiting, their eyes fixed on the station, their bodies held in a posture of patient vigilance that was more terrifying than any attack could have been. "The ice bridge was the only escape route," Chen said, "and they've cut it off. They knew we would try to use it, they knew we would wait for better weather, and they prepared." "How could they know that?" Hale asked. "How could animals understand escape routes and strategic planning?" "Because they are not animals," Yuki said. "They are something else, something that has been planning and strategizing and learning for longer than we have been alive." The sounds from the roof changed. The tapping stopped, replaced by a new noise, a rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the station's structure and made the light fixtures sway. The Adlet were jumping or stomping or hammering, creating a percussion that was too regular to be random, too complex to be mere vandalism. "What are they doing?" Priya asked, her hands pressed over her ears. "They're testing," Yuki said, "testing the structure, finding weak points, measuring resonance. They're engineers, Dr. Chen. They're treating this like an engineering problem." "Then we show them that this structure is not weak," Chen said, and there was a steel in her voice that had not been there before. "We reinforce the roof. We brace the walls. We make this place so solid that they'll break their claws trying to get in." They worked through the night, or what passed for night in a world where the sun did not rise. They used furniture, equipment, anything they could find to reinforce the ceiling and shore up the walls. They stacked crates of supplies against the windows, creating barricades that would slow any breach. They prepared the hunting rifles, loading them with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial, and they assigned positions, angles of fire, fallback points. But the Adlet did not attack. They continued their testing, their pounding, their tapping, their communication. They moved across the roof in patterns that seemed almost decorative, almost artistic, a choreography of threat that was designed to terrify rather than destroy. And then, just before dawn, the father appeared. He was larger than the others. That was the first thing they noticed when he stepped into the light of the station's exterior lamps. He stood on the ridge that the scout had occupied 3 nights earlier, but where the scout had been cautious, almost shy, the father was commanding, dominant, utterly fearless. He was the size of a large man, perhaps 6 feet tall when he stood upright, but his proportions were all wrong for human. His legs were too short, too heavily muscled, bending backward at the knee in a way that spoke of canine ancestry. His torso was long and deep-chested, covered in a pelt of reddish-brown fur that was thicker and more lustrous than the others. And his head was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. It was not just the size of the skull, or the length of the snout, or the sharpness of the teeth. It was the eyes. They were human eyes, not just forward-facing and binocular, but human in their expression, their intelligence, their depth. They held a knowledge that was ancient and patient and utterly alien. They held the weight of generations of hunting, of learning, of evolving. They held the memory of every human who had ever encountered the Adlet and failed to survive. And he spoke. "Come out," the father said, and his voice was not a mimicry. It was not a copy of Henderson or Whitfield or any of the others. It was his own voice, a deep, resonant bass that carried across the snow with a clarity that was almost musical. "Come out and we will be quick. Come out and we will be gentle. Hide and we will be thorough." "My God," Chen whispered. "It can talk, it can actually talk." "I can talk," the father said, and his voice was closer now, though he had not moved. "I can think, I can plan, I can remember. I remember the first humans who came to this valley. I remember the stones they raised to keep us here. I remember the woman who was our mother, who loved us and feared us and tried to kill us. I remember everything, and I have learned." "Learned what?" Chen shouted through the wall, her voice trembling but defiant. "Learned that stones can be moved. Learned that walls can be climbed. Learned that humans are not gods. They are meat. They are memory. They are the raw material from which we make ourselves." "We're not raw material," Marcus shouted. "We're people, we're human beings." "Yes," the father said, and there was something in his voice that might have been sadness or might have been satisfaction or might have been both. "You are human, and we are not. And that is the tragedy that binds us. That is the debt that must be paid." "What debt?" Chen asked. "The genetic debt," the father said. "The blood that was spilled when our mother chose one child over the others. The separation that was forced upon us by the ones who raised the stones. The imprisonment that lasted for centuries. And now, at last, the door is open. The stones have been moved, and we are free." "We'll put them back," Hale said, his voice breaking. "We'll put the stones back. We'll restore the boundary. Just leave us alone." "Too late," the father said. "The boundary was never just stone. It was belief. It was fear. It was the agreement between your kind and ours that some places were forbidden. And you broke that agreement. You moved the stones. You entered our valley. You claimed our land. And now you must pay the price." "What price?" Chen asked. "The price of kinship," the father said. "The price of blood. The price of becoming what we have always been, neither human nor animal, but something in between. Something that belongs to both worlds and neither." The pounding on the roof resumed, louder now, more violent, and the station structure groaned under the assault. The father had given the signal. The siege was entering its final phase. "We need to get out," Marcus said. "We need to find another way. The river, the cliffs, something." "The river is blocked," Chen said. "The cliffs are impassable. We have no options." "Then we fight," Priya said, and she was holding the hunting rifle with a grip that was white-knuckled but steady. "We fight until we can't fight anymore." "We can't win," Hale said. "There are too many of them. They're too fast, too smart." "Then we take as many with us as we can," Chen said. "We make them pay for every inch." They took their positions. Chen and Priya at the front windows, rifles ready. Marcus at the side door, a fire extinguisher in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Yuki at the radio, though it was still dead, still transmitting nothing but silence into the void. And Hale. Hale sat in the corner, his face in his hands, his body shaking with a fear that had finally broken through the armor of his corporate confidence. The father spoke again, and this time his voice was not words but sound. A scream. A human scream. Not the mimicry of Henderson or Whitfield, but a composite, a symphony of human agony that was compiled from every victim the Adlet had ever taken. It was the scream of a woman in childbirth. The scream of a man falling from a height. The scream of a child watching its parents die. The scream of every terror that had ever existed in the human heart, combined into a single frequency that was so devastating, so emotionally annihilating, that Chen felt her knees buckle and her rifle fall from nerveless fingers. "Don't listen," Yuki shouted, her own hands pressed over her ears. "It's psychological warfare. It's designed to break our will." But they listened. They could not help but listen. The scream went on, rising and falling, twisting through registers and timbres that no human voice could produce, penetrating the walls and the barricades and the fortifications that they had built, reaching into their minds and their hearts and their souls with a precision that was surgical. "Come out," the father said when the scream finally faded. "Come out and join us, become us, remember with us. We are your kin, we are your blood, we are the part of you that you have forgotten." "Never," Chen whispered, but her voice was weak, and her hands were shaking, and she knew, with a certainty that was deeper than courage, that they could not hold out much longer. The roof gave way. It was not a collapse, not a structural failure, but a breach. The Adlet had found a weak point, a seam between the plywood and the steel frame, and they had worked at it with a patience that was inhuman, a persistence that was mechanical, until the seam had widened into a gap and the gap had become a hole. And through the hole, red-brown fur and black claws and white teeth began to pour. Chen raised her rifle and fired. The shot was deafening in the confined space, and the recoil slammed her shoulder against the wall. An Adlet fell, tumbling from the ceiling with a cry that was almost human, almost surprised, and landed in a heap on the floor. But there were more, many more. They poured through the hole like water, like smoke, like a living flood that could not be stopped by bullets or barriers or desperate hope. "Fall back," Chen screamed. "Fall back to the supply room." They ran. Through the chaos, through the bodies, through the screams that were human and inhuman and both at once. Marcus fell, his ankle catching on a chair leg, and Priya grabbed his arm and hauled him up, and they stumbled together toward the supply room, the last defensible space in the station. But the Adlet were already there. They had breached the back wall, tearing through the insulation with claws that were designed for exactly this purpose, and they were waiting in the corridor, their eyes gleaming, their bodies poised, their teeth bared in expressions that were not smiles but something older and more terrible. They were surrounded. The father entered last, ducking through the hole in the roof with a grace that was almost human, almost courtly. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by his pack, and looked at the 5 survivors with an expression that might have been pity, or might have been hunger, or might have been both. "The end," he said, and his voice was gentle, almost tender. "The end of the separation, the beginning of the reunion." "What do you want?" Chen asked, her rifle empty, her body pressed against the wall, her mind racing through possibilities that did not exist. "What we have always wanted," the father said, "to be whole, to be one, to close the circle that was broken when our mother looked at us and saw monsters." "You're not monsters," Yuki said, and her voice was steady, almost calm, the voice of a woman who had finally understood something that had eluded her for days. "You're not monsters, you're just lost. You're lost and you're looking for home." The father turned to look at her, and his eyes, those terrible human eyes, held something that might have been surprise. "Yes," he said, "we are lost. We have been lost for 10,000 years, and you are the map. You are the key. You are the blood that will show us the way home." "Then take me," Yuki said, stepping forward. "Take me and let the others go." "No," Chen screamed. But the father was already moving, his hand, his paw, his claw reaching out to touch Yuki's face with a gentleness that was more obscene than any violence could have been. "Yes," he said. "You understand. You have always understood. You are the one we have been waiting for." Yuki did not resist. She stood still, her eyes closed, her body relaxed, as the father's claw traced the line of her jaw, her throat, her collarbone. And then, with a speed that was breathtaking, he struck. Not to kill, not to maim, but to mark. His claw opened a shallow cut on Yuki's shoulder, a line of blood that welled up and ran down her arm, and he raised his paw to his mouth and tasted it. "Yes," he said, his eyes closing in an expression that was almost ecstasy. "Yes, the blood remembers, the blood knows, the blood is the bridge." "What are you doing?" Chen screamed. "What have you done to her?" "I have claimed her," the father said. "I have marked her. She is kin now. She belongs to us. And the rest of you will be claimed too, one by one, until the debt is paid, until the circle is closed, until the red kin are whole." He turned away, and the pack parted to let him pass, and he walked out of the station into the darkness, his body moving with a grace that was neither human nor animal, but something that was older than both. Yuki stood where he had left her, her hand pressed to the wound on her shoulder, her eyes open but unseeing, her face transformed by an expression that was not fear and not resignation but something else, something that had no name in any human language. "Yuki," Priya whispered. "Yuki, are you okay?" "I am kin," Yuki said, and her voice was different, deeper, resonant with harmonics that had not been there before. "I am kin, and I remember." "Remember what?" The ruins were older than the station. That was the first thing Victor Hale noticed as he stumbled through the snow, fleeing from the nightmare that had consumed Outpost Polaris, fleeing from the screams and the blood and the thing that Yuki had become. The ruins were not marked on any map. They were not mentioned in any survey report. They were a memory of stone and bone that had been buried by centuries of snow and ice, and they had been revealed only by the violence of the Adlet siege, by the tremors that had shaken the permafrost and cracked the frozen earth like an eggshell. Hale had run not from courage but from panic. When the roof had given way, when the Adlet had poured into the station like a red tide, he had not stayed to fight. He had not stayed to help. He had grabbed his coat and his satellite phone, dead, useless, a piece of plastic and silicon that mocked him with its silence, and he had run through the back door, into the darkness, into the snow, into the Arctic night that swallowed his footsteps and his screams with an indifference that was almost holy. He had run until he could run no more, until his lungs were burning and his legs were jelly, and his mind was a blur of terror and guilt and the desperate animal need to survive. And then he had fallen, face first, into a snowbank, and when he had clawed his way up, gasping, weeping, he had seen the ruins. They were the remains of a settlement, a collection of stone foundations and half-collapsed walls that had once been a village, a hunting camp, a place where human beings had lived and died and been buried in the shallow graves that the Adlet had learned to exploit. The stones were weathered, smoothed by centuries of wind and ice, but their arrangement was still visible, a pattern of circles and lines that suggested organization, planning, culture. And in the center of the ruins, standing alone in a space that had been cleared of snow by some recent disturbance, was an Inuksuq. Not the kind that Hale had moved, not the simple cairns that had marked the valley's boundary. This was an older structure, a tower of balanced stones that rose nearly 10 feet into the air, each stone placed with a precision that spoke of intention and meaning. It was shaped like a human figure, arms outstretched, head tilted back, as though it were looking at the stars or praying to the sky. And at its base, half buried in the snow, was a slab of flat stone that had been carved with symbols. Hale approached it. He did not want to approach it. Every instinct screamed at him to keep running, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the nightmare behind him. But something drew him forward, something that was stronger than fear, something that felt almost like memory. The symbols on the slab were not writing, not exactly. They were a combination of pictographs and geometric patterns, images that had been chipped into the stone with a patience that spanned generations. Hale was not an archaeologist. He was not an anthropologist. He was a surveyor, a man who measured land and marked boundaries and cared nothing for the past. But he recognized some of the symbols: the curved line that represented the horizon, the jagged line that represented mountains, the circle with a dot in the center that represented the sun. And the human figure, or almost human, with a body that was wrong in its proportions, too long in the torso, too short in the legs, too something in the head. The figure was surrounded by dogs or creatures that were almost dogs, and the dogs were eating something. Something that looked like a human body, something that looked like a sacrifice. Hale knelt in the snow, his gloved fingers tracing the lines of the carving, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had seen this image before, not in stone, but in paper, in a file that his company had given him before he came to the Arctic, a file that he had dismissed as irrelevant, as corporate due diligence, as paperwork that needed to be signed and filed and forgotten. The file had contained a genealogy. His genealogy. Hale's grandmother had been Inuit. He had never known her. She had died before he was born, and his father had rarely spoken of her, and the family had assimilated into white Canadian culture with a thoroughness that bordered on shame. But the file had traced his ancestry back 5 generations, through his grandmother to her mother before that, a line of women who had lived on the coast of Ellesmere Island, who had hunted seals and raised children and told stories around the fire. And one of those stories had been about the Adlet. Not just any story, the origin myth, the tale of the woman who had been alone in the wilderness, who had given birth to 5 children, 4 of whom were dogs and 1 of whom was human. The woman who had tried to kill the dogs, who had been stopped by the human child, who had raised the dogs as her own until they grew into something that was neither dog nor human but something in between. The woman who had become, through her sacrifice and her love and her terror, the ancestor of both the Inuit and the Adlet. Hale's great-great-great-grandmother. The file had mentioned it only in passing, a footnote in the genealogy that had seemed quaint, folkloric, irrelevant to the business of drilling platforms and corporate expansion. But now, kneeling in the snow beside the ancient stone, tracing the lines of the carving with fingers that were numb with cold and shock, Hale understood that the footnote was not quaint. It was not folkloric. It was not irrelevant. It was the reason he was here. The Adlet were not hunting him because he was food. They were hunting him because he was kin. Because his blood, diluted through 5 generations of assimilation and denial, still carried the genetic memory of the dog woman. Because the Adlet could smell that blood, could taste it, could recognize it across the centuries of separation. Because the father's words, the debt must be paid, the blood must be shared, the circle must be closed, were not metaphors. They were literal. They were biological. They were the expression of a genetic imperative that was older than human civilization. Hale stood up. His knees were shaking and his vision was blurring, and he knew that he was on the edge of hypothermia, shock, madness. But he also knew something else. He knew that he was not just a victim. He was a destination. The Adlet had not chased him randomly. They had herded him here to this place, to these ruins, to this stone that marked the place where the story had begun. "You're not hunting me," he whispered to the darkness, to the snow, to the Adlet that he knew were watching from the shadows beyond the ruins. "You're claiming me. You're bringing me home." The response came not as words but as movement. A figure stepped from behind the Inuksuq, its body silhouetted against the faint glow of the aurora that was beginning to pulse in the northern sky. It was the father. Not angry, not threatening, but patient, waiting, almost welcoming. "Victor Hale," the father said, and his voice was warm, almost familial, the voice of a relative who had been waiting for a long-lost cousin to return. "You have come home." "I'm not home," Hale said, but his voice was weak and his body was trembling, and he knew that he was lying. "This is not my home. I don't belong here." "You belong where your blood belongs," the father said, "and your blood belongs with us. It always has. The woman who was our mother was your mother's mother's mother. The line is direct. The connection is real. You are not an outsider, Victor. You are not a victim. You are kin. You are the reason we are here. You are the key that opens the door." "What door?" Hale asked. "The door between what we are and what we were meant to be," the father said. "The door that was closed when the stones were raised. The door that was locked when your ancestors chose to become human and leave us behind. We have been waiting for someone like you, someone with the blood of both worlds, someone who can bridge the gap, someone who can make us whole." "I can't make you whole," Hale said. "I'm just a man. I'm just a surveyor. I move rocks. I measure land. I don't have any power." "You have the only power that matters," the father said. "You have the blood, and the blood is the bridge. The blood is the memory. The blood is the key that unlocks the door." He stepped closer, and Hale saw his face in the aurora light, and he understood why the Adlet were so terrifying. Not because they were monsters, not because they were killers, but because they were family, because they were related to him, connected to him, bound to him by a genetic thread that stretched back 10,000 years to a woman who had loved her children so much that she had been unable to kill the ones that were different. "The others," Hale said, his voice barely audible. "The scientists, the students, what about them?" "They are food," the father said, and there was no cruelty in the word, only practicality, only the simple logic of survival. "They do not carry the blood. They are not kin. They are the price that must be paid for the door to open." "And me?" "You are the door," the father said. "You are the bridge. You are the one who will lead us out of the valley, out of the darkness, out of the prison that your ancestors built for us. You will teach us. You will guide us. You will help us become what we were meant to be." "I don't want to teach you," Hale whispered. "I don't want to guide you. I just want to go home." "This is home," the father said, and he reached out with his claw, not to strike but to touch, to connect, to claim. "This has always been home, and now at last you have come back to us." Hale felt the claw on his shoulder, and the touch was not cold but warm, warmer than the snow, warmer than the air, warm with a biological heat that spoke of metabolism and life, and the ancient bond between creatures that shared a common ancestry. And he felt something else, something that was deeper than touch, something that resonated in his blood and his bones and the marrow of his being. He felt belonging. Not the belonging of a human to a human community, not the belonging of a citizen to a nation, but something older, something primal, something that predated civilization and language and the artificial boundaries that humans had built between themselves and the natural world. It was the belonging of a cub to a pack, of a pup to a litter, of a child to a mother who had loved him enough to let him go and who had waited 10,000 years for him to return. "No," Hale said, but the word was weak, and his body was leaning into the touch, and some part of him, some part that he had never known existed, some part that had been suppressed by 5 generations of assimilation and denial, was responding to the father's presence with a recognition that was older than reason. "Yes," the father said, "you feel it, you have always felt it, the pull, the call, the need to run, to hunt, to belong to something larger than yourself. You thought it was ambition, you thought it was greed, you thought it was the corporate drive to succeed, but it was never those things. It was us. It was the blood. It was the memory of what you were meant to be." Hale wept. He wept not from fear but from grief, from the overwhelming sadness of a man who had spent his entire life running from something that he could not name, only to discover that the thing he was running from was himself, his heritage, his blood, his kin. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Come with us," the father said. "Learn from us, remember with us, and when the time is right, lead us. Lead us out of the valley, lead us into the world of men. Lead us to the others who carry the blood, the hidden kin, the lost children who do not know what they are." "And if I refuse?" The father's eyes, those terrible human eyes, held something that might have been sadness. "Then you will be food," he said. "Like the others, like all who carry the blood but refuse the call. We do not waste kin, Victor, but we do not allow kin to betray us. The choice is yours." Hale looked at the ruins around him, at the stones that had been placed by hands that were related to his own, at the carvings that told a story that was his story, at the Inuksuck that stood like a sentinel over the place where the world had changed. He thought of the station, of the scientists who had trusted him, of the blood that was being spilled even now in the name of an ancient debt that he had never agreed to pay. He thought of his grandmother, the Inuit woman whose name he barely remembered, whose face he had never seen, whose blood ran in his veins with a persistence that defied assimilation. He thought of her stories, her songs, her silences. He thought of the way his father had refused to speak of her, the way the family had buried her heritage beneath layers of white Canadian respectability, the way they had tried to erase the past with a thoroughness that was almost violent. And he thought of the Adlet who had not erased the past, who had remembered, who had kept the stories alive in their whistles and their taps and their genetic memories that spanned millennia, who had waited, who had been patient, who had never forgotten the woman who was their mother or the human child who had been their brother, or the line of descendants that had led, through 5 generations of silence, to this moment, this place, this choice. "I need time," Hale said. "Time is what we have," the father said. "We have waited 10,000 years. We can wait a little longer." He turned away, his body moving with a grace that was almost human, almost familiar, and he walked into the darkness beyond the ruins. And Hale stood alone in the snow, beside the stone that marked the place where his story had begun, and he wept. Not for himself, not for the scientists who were dying at the station, but for the tragedy of a world that had been divided by a choice made in fear and loneliness 10,000 years ago. The tragedy of a mother who had loved her children but could not accept them. The tragedy of a separation that had created 2 species where there should have been one. And he wept for himself because he knew, with a certainty that was deeper than denial, that the father was right. He was kin. He was blood. He was the bridge. And the door was opening. Dr. Sarah Chen had always believed that the universe was fundamentally rational. That behind every phenomenon, no matter how bizarre or terrifying, there was a natural explanation waiting to be discovered. That the scientific method, applied with sufficient rigor and persistence, could unravel any mystery and reduce any nightmare to a set of variables that could be understood, predicted, and controlled. She did not believe that anymore. She believed in claws. She believed in teeth. She believed in the wet percussion of bodies moving across a station roof in the middle of an Arctic night, and the sound of a human voice speaking from a throat that was not human, and the weight of a gaze that could strip away sanity like paint from a wall. She believed in the Adlet, and she believed, with a certainty that was deeper than any scientific principle, that she was going to die. But she was not dead yet. Not quite. And as long as she was alive, she had a choice. She could surrender to the fear, to the despair, to the creeping certainty that the world had become a place where human beings were no longer the apex predators. Or she could fight. She could resist. She could use the one advantage that the Adlet, for all their intelligence and coordination, did not seem to possess. She could understand explosives. The station's fuel depot was her idea. It had been Marcus who pointed it out, during the frantic hours after the Adlet had breached the station, but before they had fully penetrated the interior. The depot was a separate structure, 50 meters from the main building, a concrete bunker that held 6,000 liters of diesel fuel for the generators. And diesel, when mixed with the right oxidizer and ignited with the right trigger, could do a great deal of damage. An avalanche, Chen had said, her voice barely audible above the pounding on the walls. We use the fuel to trigger an avalanche. The outpost is built against a slope. There's a cornice above it, a hanging glacier that I've been monitoring for weeks. It's unstable. It's ready to go. All it needs is a push. That's insane, Priya had whispered. We'd be burying ourselves. Not if we run, Chen said. Not if we time it right. The avalanche would bury the station, bury the pack, bury everything. And we'd be outside on the flat ground beyond the slope where the snow would pass over us. And if we're wrong, Marcus asked, if the avalanche doesn't behave the way your models predict, if it spreads wider, faster, deeper. Then we die, Chen said. But we're going to die anyway if we stay here. At least this way we choose, we fight. We don't just wait to be eaten. They had prepared during the hours of darkness, while the Adlet prowled the roof and the walls and the corridors that they had not yet breached. They had gathered what they could, coats, boots, food, the flare gun, the remaining rifle, and they had waited for the moment when the Adlet's attention was elsewhere. The moment when the father was at the ruins, claiming Victor Hale. The moment when the pack was distracted by the prospect of new kin and the old prey was forgotten. It was Yuki who gave them the opening. Or rather, it was the thing that had been Yuki, the creature that wore her face and spoke with her voice and moved with a grace that was not quite human and not quite animal. She had appeared at the barricaded door of the supply room, her eyes golden in the lamplight, her smile too wide, her teeth too sharp. "Come out," she had said, and her voice was Yuki's voice, but it was also the father's voice, and beneath both was something older, something that spoke of hunger and memory and the terrible loneliness of a species that had been divided against itself. "Come out and join us. The debt is being paid. The circle is closing. You do not need to be afraid." "We're not coming out," Chen had said, her rifle aimed at the door, her hands steady despite the terror that was consuming her from the inside. "And you're not Yuki. Whatever you are, you're not her." "I am more than Yuki," the creature had said. "I am Yuki and the father and the mother and all the kin who have ever lived. I am the memory that does not die. I am the blood that does not forget. And I am offering you a gift, the gift of belonging, the gift of family, the gift of never being alone again." "We don't want your gift," Priya had screamed. "We want you to leave us alone." "That is not possible," the creature said, and there was genuine sadness in its voice, a sorrow that was almost human. "The separation is ending, the door is opening, and all who carry the blood must pass through." It had turned away then, distracted by a sound from outside, a whistle that was clearly a signal, and Chen had seized the moment. She had opened the window, the one that faced away from the Adlet's main concentration, the one that led to the narrow gap between the station and the fuel depot, and she had signaled to Marcus and Priya. "Now run and don't look back." They ran, through the snow, through the darkness, through the Arctic night that was so cold it burned. They ran toward the fuel depot, their boots slipping on ice, their breath coming in ragged gasps that crystallized in the air before them. They ran while the Adlet were distracted, while the pack was focused on the father and his new prize, while the window of opportunity was open. They reached the depot. Marcus broke the lock with a fire extinguisher, and they slipped inside, into the darkness that smelled of petroleum and metal, and the faint, lingering scent of something that was almost like home. Chen found the valves, the pipes, the pressure gauges that she had inspected 100 times in her previous life, when the station was a place of science and not a fortress under siege. "We need to create a leak," she said, her voice calm, almost clinical, the voice of a woman who had retreated into professionalism because the alternative was madness. "A big leak. We open the main valve, let the fuel flow out, and then we ignite it. The explosion will weaken the cornice. The heat will melt the ice at the base. The whole slope will go." "And the Adlet?" Priya asked. "Buried," Chen said. "Buried under 10,000 tons of snow and ice." "And the station?" "Also buried, also gone." "And Victor?" Marcus asked. "And Yuki?" Chen paused. Her hands were on the valve, ready to turn, ready to begin the process that would destroy everything they had built. Victor made his choice, she said finally. He went to them. He chose the father. And Yuki is already gone. Whatever's wearing her face, it's not her anymore. How do you know? Priya whispered. Because I saw her eyes, Chen said, and there was nothing human left in them. She turned the valve. The fuel began to flow, a thick, dark liquid that pooled on the concrete floor and spread toward the door with a speed that was almost alive. The smell was overwhelming, petroleum and something else, something that made Chen's head swim and her vision blur. They had minutes, maybe less, before the depot was flooded, before the fumes reached critical concentration, before the slightest spark would turn the bunker into a fireball. We need to get clear, Marcus said. We need to run now before. The door opened. Not from the inside, from the outside, and standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the aurora light, was Victor Hale. He was changed. That was the first thing Chen noticed. His posture was different, his shoulders hunched forward, his head tilted at an angle that was not quite human. His eyes were wrong, the pupils too large, the irises reflecting the green of the aurora in a way that made them look almost canine. And his hands, which had been folded in his pockets, were now visible, and they were trembling, the fingers curling and uncurling in a pattern that was almost like claws. Victor, Chen said, her voice steady despite the terror that was clawing at her throat. Victor, step away from the door. We're leaving. I know, Hale said, and his voice was different too, deeper, resonant with harmonics that had not been there before. I know you're leaving, and I know what you're planning, the explosion, the avalanche, the burial. Then step aside, Chen said. Let us go. I can't, Hale said, and there was genuine sorrow in his voice, a sadness that was almost human. I can't let you destroy them. They're my kin. They're my family, and the father says that I must protect them, that I must choose. Choose what? Marcus asked. Choose between the blood and the world, Hale said. Between the kin and the strangers, between what I was and what I am. He stepped into the depot and the door closed behind him, and Chen saw that he was not alone. Behind him, waiting in the darkness, were the Adlet, dozens of them, their eyes gleaming in the faint light, their bodies pressed against the bunker walls, their breath steaming in the cold air. Victor, Chen said, and her voice was barely a whisper, don't do this. I have to, Hale said. The father has shown me the truth. The stones were moved. The door was opened, and now the debt must be paid, the blood must be shared, the circle must be closed. He reached for her, and his hand was warm, warmer than it should have been, warm with a biological heat that spoke of the changes that were happening inside him, the genetic memory that was awakening, the kinship that was claiming him. Chen pulled the trigger. Not of the rifle. The rifle was empty, its magazine spent in the defense of the station. She pulled the trigger of the flare gun that she had hidden in her coat, the flare gun that she had loaded with the last remaining flare, the flare that was not just a signal but a weapon. The flare shot past Hale's shoulder, trailing a tail of sparks and smoke, and buried itself in the pool of diesel that was spreading across the depot floor. The world became fire. The explosion was not a sound but a force, a physical blow that lifted Chen off her feet and threw her through the depot wall as though it were paper. She hit the snow, rolling, tumbling, her body battered by debris and shock wave, and the searing heat that seemed to consume the air itself. She felt Marcus beside her, felt Priya's hand in hers, and they ran, stumbling, crawling, dragging themselves across the snow toward the flat ground that Chen had identified as the safe zone. Behind them, the fuel depot was a pillar of flame, a tower of fire that rose 50 meters into the air and turned the night into day. The station caught fire, its wooden walls and insulation and supplies feeding the inferno with a greed that was almost obscene. And above them, on the slope, the cornice began to move. It started as a crack, a sound like thunder that was deeper and more resonant than any thunder could be. Then it became a rumble, a vibration that traveled through the ground and into their bones, a frequency that spoke of massive forces being unleashed. And then it became a roar, a wall of white that descended from the heights with a speed that was terrifying and beautiful and utterly unstoppable. The avalanche. Chen threw herself flat, pulling Marcus and Priya down with her, pressing their faces into the snow as the wall of snow and ice passed over them. It was not a direct hit. They were on the edge of the flow, in the zone where the snow was fastest but least deep, and they felt the pressure, the weight, the terrible force of 10,000 tons of frozen water passing inches above their heads. They held their breath, their lungs burning, their bodies shaking, and they prayed, not to any god that Chen had ever believed in, but to the simple, desperate hope that the snow would pass, that the ground would be solid, that they would survive. And then it was over. The rumble faded, the pressure lifted, the snow settled, and Chen raised her head, spitting ice, gasping air, blinking against the light of the burning station that was already being buried by the avalanche's aftermath. The station was gone. The depot was gone. The slope was a smooth, white surface that looked almost peaceful, almost pristine, as though nothing had ever existed there. And beneath that surface, buried under tons of snow and ice, were the Adlet, the pack, the father, the nightmare that had consumed Outpost Polaris and everyone in it. "We did it," Marcus whispered, his voice muffled by the snow that covered his face. "We actually did it." "Not yet," Chen said, her voice hoarse. "We need to move, we need to get clear, we need to find shelter." "Where?" Priya asked. "Everything's gone." "The coast," Chen said. "We walk to the coast 30 kilometers, we can do it." They walked. Through the snow, through the darkness, through the Arctic night that seemed to go on forever. They walked with a desperation that was almost supernatural, fueled by adrenaline and fear and the simple, animal need to survive. They walked until their feet were numb, until their faces were frostbitten, until their minds were reduced to a single imperative: forward, forward, forward. And on the morning of the second day, when the sky was beginning to lighten with the first faint promise of the returning sun, they saw it. The helicopter. It was a twin otter, modified for Arctic rescue, its orange hull a beacon of hope against the white. It was hovering over the valley, its searchlight sweeping the snow, and Chen found the flare gun in her pocket. She had reloaded it somehow in the frantic minutes after the explosion, and she fired. The flare rose, a brilliant red star against the pale sky, and the helicopter turned toward them, its rotors beating the air with a sound that was the most beautiful thing Chen had ever heard. They were lifted aboard, wrapped in blankets, given hot coffee and medical attention, and the reassurances of professionals who had seen survivors before. They were flown to the coastal research station, and from there to a hospital in Iqaluit, and from there to a debriefing in Ottawa that lasted 3 days and produced a report that was classified and buried and forgotten. The official story was an accident, a fuel leak, an explosion. The deaths of 7 people, Dr. James Whitfield, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Victor Hale, and 4 support staff, were attributed to the fire and the avalanche. The bodies were never recovered, buried too deep beneath the snow to be found. The station was abandoned. The drilling project was canceled, and Outpost Polaris became a footnote in the history of Arctic research, a cautionary tale about safety protocols and fuel storage. But Chen knew the truth, Priya knew the truth, Marcus knew the truth, and they carried it with them, a secret that was too terrible to share, too unbelievable to tell, too dangerous to forget. 3 weeks after the rescue, Chen was discharged from the hospital. She had been given a clean bill of health, though the doctors had noted the frostbite on her fingers and the haunted look in her eyes that no amount of therapy seemed to dispel. She had been offered counseling, medication, a sabbatical from her academic duties. She had accepted none of them. She had only one request. She wanted to see the photographs. The rescue team had taken photographs during the evacuation, standard documentation of the site before the official investigation was closed. Chen had requested them through a friend in the government, and they had arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. She sat in her hotel room, the curtains drawn, the lights dim, and she opened the envelope. The photographs were standard aerial shots, taken from the helicopter as it had circled the valley before landing. They showed the avalanche site, the smooth white surface where the station had been, the surrounding terrain of ice and rock and snow. They showed nothing unusual, nothing anomalous, nothing that would suggest anything other than a natural disaster. And then Chen saw the last photograph. It was taken from a distance, a wide shot of the valley's eastern ridge, the peak that rose above the avalanche site. The ridge was empty, or should have been empty. The avalanche had buried everything. The Adlet were gone. The pack was gone. The father was gone. But the photograph showed something. A figure standing on the peak, alone. It was an Adlet. There was no doubt about that. The proportions were wrong for human, the posture too hunched, the limbs too muscular. But it was not just any Adlet. It was scarred, its fur matted with blood, its body bearing the marks of the explosion and the avalanche. One arm hung limp at its side, broken or dislocated. Its face was a mass of wounds that had frozen into grotesque shapes. And it was looking at the helicopter. Not with animal rage, not with predator hunger, but with something else. Something that made Chen's blood run cold and her hands tremble and her mind reject what her eyes were seeing. The Adlet was smiling. Not a snarl, not a threat display, but a smile, a human smile. The corners of its mouth turned up, its eyes crinkled at the edges, its expression one of almost parental affection, almost familial warmth. And then, as the helicopter banked away and the photograph was taken, the Adlet opened its mouth. Not to howl, not to scream, not to roar, but to speak. The photograph captured the moment. The mouth was open, the lips were forming words, the tongue was visible behind the teeth. And though the photograph had no sound, Chen could read the word in the shape of the lips, in the position of the tongue, in the expression of the eyes. Victor. The name was clear, distinct, unmistakable. Victor. The Adlet had spoken, not mimicked, not copied, but spoken. A human word in a human voice with human intention and human meaning. The Red Kin had learned to communicate, not through whistles and taps and the crude approximations of animal language, but through words, through language, through the very thing that made humans human. And the word they had chosen was the name of the man who had been claimed, the man who had been kin, the man who had chosen the blood over the world. Chen dropped the photograph. She sat in the dim light of the hotel room, her body shaking, her mind reeling, and she understood, with a finality that was more terrible than any avalanche could be, that the Adlet had not been defeated. They had not been buried. They had not been destroyed. They had been taught. Taught by the explosion, taught by the resistance, taught by the humans who had fought them and survived. They had learned that humans could be dangerous. They had learned that humans could be resourceful, and they had learned that humans could be kin. The scarred Adlet on the peak was not a survivor. It was a messenger, a herald, a sign that the Red Kin had evolved beyond the valley, beyond the stones, beyond the ancient separation that had kept them confined for millennia. They had learned to speak. They had learned to smile. They had learned to communicate across the boundary between species. And they had learned Victor's name. Chen thought of Hale, buried beneath the snow, his body claimed by the avalanche and the kinship that had consumed him. She thought of Yuki, her face worn by a creature that was not her voice used to lure the living to their deaths. She thought of the father with his patient eyes and his ancient voice, waiting in the darkness for the door to open. And she thought of the future, a future where the Adlet were not legends but neighbors, where the Red Kin were not monsters but relatives, where the boundary between human and animal was not a wall but a bridge, and the blood that flowed on both sides was the same blood, shared, remembered, claimed. The photograph lay on the floor, face up, the scarred Adlet staring at the ceiling with its human smile and its human word. And Chen sat in the chair, staring at the wall, listening to the silence that was no longer empty but full of voices that she could not hear, full of words that she could not understand, full of a future that she did not want to imagine. The helicopter had flown away, the avalanche had buried the past, the rescue was complete. But the red kin were still there, still watching, still learning, still waiting for the next person to move the stones, to open the door, to speak the name that would bring them out of the darkness and into the light. And somewhere beneath the snow, beneath the ice, beneath the weight of 10,000 tons of frozen water, Victor Hale was smiling too. Because he was home, he was kin, he was claimed. And the circle at last was closing. Outside, the sun was rising over the Arctic, and the snow was gleaming, and the world was quiet. But in the quiet, if you listened carefully, you could hear them. The whistles, the taps, the words. The red kin speaking at last. And they were saying, "We remember, we are coming, and we are no longer alone." The Tripwire Canopy. Stop stepping on the leaves. For the love of God, stop stepping on the leaves. The voice was Kahlo's, but it came out shredded, as though his throat had been rubbed raw against the inside of his own terror. It was the kind of voice a man made when he had seen something that rewired the basic architecture of his understanding, when the world had tilted on its axis and shown him the wet, gleaming underbelly of what truly waited beneath the veneer of normalcy. The words were not a request. They were a scream compressed into the shape of a sentence. Behind him, Elias heard the sound before he understood it. A wet, muscular snap, not the dry crack of a twig but something tensioned, something that had been holding potential energy like a coiled spring, and then the release. It was followed by a shriek that began as a human sound, full of air and language and identity, and ended with a heavy, chitinous thud. The kind of sound a ripe melon might make when dropped onto stone from a great height, except this melon was skull, and the stone was something else entirely, something that lived and breathed and had been waiting for exactly this vibration. Elias did not turn around. He could not. His body had become a monument to paralysis, every muscle locked in a rigor of primal refusal. He was staring at a patch of forest floor no wider than his own 2 feet, a mosaic of decaying leaf litter and the pale, hair-like filaments of fungal mycelium threading through the humus like the nervous system of some buried giant. He could hear the others breathing, if they were still breathing. The sound of Kahlo's warning echoed and died in the cathedral vault of the canopy, and what replaced it was a silence so absolute, so profoundly wrong, that Elias felt his eardrums strain for something to process. The jungle was never silent. The jungle was a machine of noise, a perpetual engine of cicadas and birds, and the endless dripping condensation that fell from leaf to leaf like a liquid metronome. But now the machine had stopped. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had stopped their mechanical droning. Even the wind seemed to have died, held in place by a pressure that emanated from the earth itself. He wanted to believe it was a dream. He had wanted to believe many things over the past 3 weeks, since the expedition had left Kinshasa and traveled by rusted jeep, and then by foot into the Ituri rainforest, deep in the northeastern corner of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He had wanted to believe that the Lloyd expedition of 1938 had been a tragedy of poor preparation and colonial arrogance, not a warning. He had wanted to believe that the map they had found in the Royal Geographical Society's archives, water-stained and torn at the margins, marked with coordinates in faded pencil, and the cryptic notation, JF nesting site, purple confirmed, was the relic of obsessed men who had died of fever or misadventure, not something that pointed toward a biological reality so far outside the taxonomy of accepted science that its very existence seemed to mock the foundations of natural history. The team had assembled in the damp heat of Kinshasa with the nervous energy of amateurs playing at a game they did not fully understand. There were 4 of them, not counting Kalo, who had been hired in Mombasa after 3 other guides had looked at their map, looked at their equipment, and walked away without explanation. Elias was the leader by default, a man in his mid-30s with a receding hairline and a backpack full of camera equipment that cost more than most Congolese families earned in a year. He had made his money in documentary filmmaking, churning out nature specials for streaming platforms that packaged the natural world into digestible 45-minute segments complete with sweeping drone shots and breathless narration. He was not a scientist, though he liked to style himself as one, and he was not an adventurer, though he desperately wanted to be. He was a man who had filmed enough to know that the world still held secrets, and he had decided that this secret, the secret of the J'Ba Fofi, the giant spider of the Baka folklore, the cryptid that had been whispered about in expedition reports since the 1930s, would be his ticket to something more than the next streaming contract. Maya was the botanist, or at least she had been once, before funding cuts had reduced her to adjunct status at a university that treated her field as an antique curiosity. She was in her late 20s, compact and muscular, with a tattoo of a cycad frond running up her left forearm and a laugh that came out in sharp, barking bursts when she was nervous. She had joined the expedition for the orchid. The Lloyd journals had made reference to a species of epiphytic orchid, genus unknown, that grew only in the vicinity of the J'Ba Fofi nesting sites. It was described as having petals the color of dried blood and a scent like rotting meat, and Maya had been unable to resist the possibility that it represented an entirely new species, something that had never been collected or cataloged. She had spent the first 2 days in a state of barely contained euphoria, cataloging ferns and mosses with the fervor of a convert, her field notebook filling with Latin names and rough sketches in waterproof ink. Then there was Derek, the team's self-appointed security expert, a former Army Ranger who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and come back with a hardness that manifested as constant, low-grade aggression. He was the one who carried the rifle, a bolt-action .375 that he claimed could stop a Cape buffalo, though they all knew that if they encountered something that required stopping, a single rifle would be about as useful as a harshly worded letter. Derek was 32, built like a tree trunk, with a shaved head that was already peeling from the equatorial sun, and a habit of chewing protein bars with his mouth open. He had joined because Elias had paid him, and because he had nothing else going on, and because there was a part of him, a part he did not acknowledge even to himself, that was still chasing the adrenaline of combat and hoped, in some dark corner of his psychology, that this expedition might provide it. And finally there was Priya, the team's medical officer and Elias' girlfriend of 2 years, though the relationship had been strained since she had discovered the true purpose of the expedition and the amount of their savings that Elias had poured into it without consulting her. She was a trauma surgeon by training, though she had left the hospital circuit to do Doctors Without Borders stints in refugee camps, and she carried herself with a competence that bordered on coldness. She was tall, with dark skin that seemed to absorb the jungle light rather than reflect it, and she had spent the first week in a state of simmering resentment that occasionally boiled over into sharp, precise observations about Elias' poor planning and worse impulse control. She had come because she was worried that without her, Elias would get himself killed, and because some part of her, despite everything, still loved the part of him that dreamed of impossible things. Kalo was different from all of them. He was Baka, one of the so-called pygmy peoples of the Congo Basin, though he bristled at the term and the colonial baggage it carried. He was short, barely 5 feet tall, with skin the color of polished mahogany and muscles that seemed to have been carved from the wood of the forest itself. He was 53 years old, though he looked younger, and he had been guiding foreigners through the Itchery for 30 of those years. He knew the forest the way a man knows his own home, not as a collection of plants and animals, but as a living entity with moods and boundaries and rules that were not negotiable. He had looked at their map for a long time when they first showed it to him in Mombasa, his finger tracing the pencil marks with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent. And then he had named a price that was 3 times what they had budgeted for a guide. "Why so much?" Elias had asked, trying to sound authoritative despite the sweat already pooling in the small of his back. Kahlo had looked at him with eyes that held no malice but also no warmth. "Because the place you want to go is not a place for walking. It is a place for being permitted, and permission costs more than money." They had paid. Of course they had paid. They had come too far and spent too much to turn back because a guide asked for an extra few $100s. And for the first week, Kahlo had been worth every cent. He moved through the forest with a grace that made the rest of them feel like lumbering giants, his bare feet finding purchase on roots and mossy stones that sent the others sliding and cursing. He identified edible plants with a glance, pointed out the calls of birds that the others could not have distinguished from the ambient noise, and constructed their camps with an efficiency that bordered on artistry, weaving palm fronds into rain shields and fashioning hooks from thorns to suspend their food bags beyond the reach of nocturnal scavengers. He had also tried to teach them how to walk. It started on the 3rd day, after they had left the last hunting trail and entered territory that Kahlo described, in his careful French, as the old paths. They had been walking in a line, as people always walk in the jungle, single file along the narrow corridors between the undergrowth, and Kahlo had stopped them with a raised hand. "Not like this," he had said. "You must not walk like this here." "Like what?" Derek had asked, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his chest. "Single file, how else do you want us to walk?" "Not in a line," Kahlo had explained, his patience wearing thin around the edges. "Staggered, erratic, like the diker moves, like the brush pig moves. Never the same foot twice, never the same path. You step here, then there, then back, then sideways." "That's insane," Derek had laughed. "We'll cover half the distance in twice the time, and we'll break our ankles on hidden routes." "The game trails," Kahlo had continued, ignoring the interruption, "are watched. The straight paths are known. If you walk like a human in a line making rhythm with your feet, you make a song that can be heard." "Heard by what?" Maya had asked, her scientific curiosity piqued. "What kind of predator keys on walking patterns?" Kahlo had looked at her for a long moment, and Elias had seen something in his expression that he would later recognize as pity. "The J'Ba Fofi does not hunt with eyes. It hunts with feeling. It feels the vibration of the forest floor through the earth, through the roots, through the silk it has stretched between the trees. If you walk in a pattern, you tell it where you are. If you walk without pattern, you are noise. Noise is harder than pattern." They had laughed. Of course they had laughed. The J'Ba Fofi was a folktale, a story told by forest-dwelling peoples to explain the dangers of the deep jungle, to keep children from wandering too far from the village. It was a boogeyman with 8 legs and a body the size of a dog, a spider large enough to snatch birds from the air and small primates from the branches. There had been expeditions to find it before. The Lloyds in 1938, a Belgian team in 1954, a Japanese television crew in the 1990s, and none of them had returned with anything more than fuzzy photographs and second-hand testimony. The scientific consensus was that the J'Ba Fofi was a cultural artifact, a legend built around sightings of large terrestrial spiders like the Goliath bird-eater, perhaps exaggerated over generations until the truth was lost in the storytelling. "We'll keep it in mind, Kahlo," Elias had said, his tone making it clear that he was humoring the guide. "But we need to make time. The rainy season is coming, and we need to reach the coordinates before the rivers flood." Kahlo had nodded, his face unreadable, and they had resumed their walking in a line, their boots crunching through the leaf litter in a steady, predictable rhythm. Elias had noticed that Kahlo walked differently now, moving off to the side, placing his feet with a deliberateness that seemed almost dance-like, but he had attributed it to the guide's eccentricity and left it at that. The false sense of security had settled over them like a warm blanket. The jungle was beautiful. There was no other word for it. The Itchery was one of the last truly intact rainforests in Central Africa, a place where the canopy stretched 200 feet overhead and blocked out all but the most determined shafts of sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that was broken only by the occasional beam of gold that pierced the leaves like a spotlight. The air was thick with humidity, so saturated that breathing felt like drinking, and every surface was covered in life, mosses and lichens and epiphytes and fungi, and the endless, crawling, flying, buzzing multitudes of insects that formed the base of the food chain. They saw hornbills with beaks like polished ivory, and chimpanzees that watched them from the high branches with ancient, knowing eyes. They heard the booming calls of gorillas in the distance, and once, on the 5th day, they found a fresh leopard print in the mud of a stream bed, the twin lobes of the pad and the 4 teardrop toes as clear as if the cat had left its signature. Maya had found the eggs on the 6th day. They were in a leaf nest, a construction of woven palm fronds and spider silk suspended between the buttress roots of a massive ceiba tree, about 3 feet off the ground. The nest was roughly the size of a soccer ball, and when Maya had carefully parted the leaves with her forceps, she had revealed a cluster of eggs, each one about the size of a peanut, whitish yellow and slightly translucent, with a texture that reminded her of wet parchment. "My God," she had whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "Look at this. Look at the silk binding. This isn't just structural, it's adhesive. The whole nest is held together with a proteinaceous secretion." Derek had leaned in, his nose wrinkling. "They stink, like old cheese or something." "They're fresh," Maya had said, ignoring him. "These are viable. Whatever laid them is still in the area." Elias had filmed the discovery, his camera's red light blinking in the dimness. "Is this it? Is this the J'Ba Fofi?" Maya had looked at him with a mixture of pity and exhilaration. "Elias, these eggs are tiny. If this is from a giant spider, it's a giant spider the size of a tarantula. The Lloyd reports talked about creatures with leg spans of 4, 5, 6 feet. Something that size would lay eggs the size of golf balls, maybe tennis balls. These are from something much smaller. A primitive species, maybe, or a juvenile." "So it's harmless," Derek had said, losing interest. "Not harmless," Kahlo had said from behind them. He had not approached the nest, Elias noticed, but stood 10 feet away, his body language tense. "Nothing in the forest is harmless, but yes, these are from the small ones. The young. The old mothers make different nests." "Different how?" Priya had asked. Kahlo had hesitated, his eyes scanning the canopy as if searching for something. "Bigger," he had said finally, "and deeper. The old mothers do not raise their young in the light. They raise them in the dark, where the roots drink from the rivers underground." They had photographed the nest, taken samples of the silk and the leaf material, and moved on. The discovery had reinforced their complacency. The J'Ba Fofi, if it existed at all, was a mid-sized spider, perhaps unusually large by temperate standards, but nothing that warranted the superstitious dread in Kahlo's voice. They began to treat the expedition as a lark, a paid vacation in one of the world's most biodiverse regions, with the added bonus of a potential documentary hook. Elias started thinking about how he would frame the narrative. The rational Westerners who had braved the jungle to investigate a legend, only to find a perfectly ordinary biological phenomenon that explained the myth. He imagined the interviews, the sweeping music, the moment of revelation when Maya held up the tiny eggs and explained that the monster was just a misunderstood arachnid. Kahlo had watched their growing levity with a silence that should have been warning enough. He had tried to teach them other things over the next few days, how to identify the dead zones in the forest where no birds sang, how to recognize the particular sheen of J'Ba Fofi silk when it was stretched across a path, how to read the subtle disturbances in the leaf litter that indicated a pit trap rather than solid ground. But they had stopped listening. Derek had started walking with his boots deliberately heavy, stomping through the undergrowth like a child playing at being a giant. Maya had begun to wander off the paths, chasing after butterflies and orchids with a carelessness that made Kahlo's jaw clench. Even Priya, the most cautious of them, had relaxed her vigilance, convinced that the real dangers of the jungle were malaria and infected cuts, not monsters. By the 9th day, they had reached the coordinates on the Lloyd map. It was a ridge of red laterite soil, elevated above the surrounding forest, covered in a tangle of lianas and saplings that made passage difficult. The map indicated a possible nesting site marked with a rough sketch of a dome-shaped structure and the words "yellow interior caution." They had found no dome, but they had found the orchid. Maya had spotted it first, a flash of crimson against the green, growing from the crook of a fallen branch that was already half reclaimed by moss. The flowers were exactly as the Lloyd journals had described, petals the color of dried blood, fleshy and thick, with a central column that pulsed with a deeper, almost arterial red. The smell was overwhelming up close, a sweet rot that made Elia's stomach twist. "It's gorgeous," Maya had breathed, reaching for her collection kit. "Absolutely gorgeous. This is going to be the discovery of the decade. We're going to name this. We're going to name this after the Lloyds." "Let's set up camp," Elias had said, already framing the shot in his mind. "We'll spend a day here, document everything, and then start heading back. We've got what we came for." That had been yesterday. The camp had been established on a flat shelf of ground 50 meters from the ridge, their tents arranged in a rough semicircle around a central fire pit. Kahlo had insisted on building the fire, though the evening was warm, and he had spent the night sitting beside it, feeding it with damp wood that produced more smoke than flame, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the ring of light. The others had slept, or tried to sleep, lulled by the false security of their accomplishment and the familiar sounds of the jungle night. Elias woke before dawn, his dreams already evaporating like morning mist, leaving behind only a residue of unease that he could not name. The forest was at its loudest just before sunrise, a crescendo of insects and frogs and the first tentative calls of birds testing the air for predators. He lay in his tent, listening to Priya's slow breathing beside him, and tried to convince himself that the anxiety in his chest was just the normal nervousness of a man who had invested too much in a project that was about to conclude. They had found the orchid. They had documented the eggs. They had enough footage and samples to justify the expedition's cost and then some. Today they would do a final sweep of the ridge, pack their gear, and begin the 2-day trek back to Mombasa. In a week, he would be in an editing suite in London, piecing together the narrative that would make his reputation. He unzipped the tent and stepped out into the gray half-light. The fire had burned down to embers, and Kahlo was nowhere to be seen, though his bedroll was still laid out beside the ashes. Elias stretched, his spine cracking in 3 places, and decided to do a quick scout of the ridge before the others woke. He wanted to get some establishing shots of the orchid in the early light, maybe a time-lapse of the mist burning off the canopy. He grabbed his camera from the equipment cache, a Canon ESC-70 in a waterproof housing, the tool of his trade and the symbol of his ambition, and slung it over his shoulder. The ridge was different in the dawn. The red laterite soil seemed to glow with an inner warmth, as though the earth itself were remembering some ancient fire. The mist moved through the trees in thick, silver coils, and the orchid was visible from 20 meters away, a spot of arterial crimson against the green and gray. Elias felt his pulse quicken with the familiar excitement of the perfect shot. He raised the camera, checked the settings, and began to move forward. He did not see the line until it touched him. It was nearly invisible, a filament of silk so fine that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, stretched at chest height between 2 saplings. Elias felt it first as a tug on his camera strap, a resistance that made him think he had snagged his equipment on a vine. He pulled back, annoyed, and heard the strap make a soft, musical twang as the tension released. The line vibrated. He watched it happen, the oscillation traveling along the filament like a wave on a string, moving away from him in both directions, carrying information he could not see to destinations he could not imagine. "What the hell?" he muttered, reaching up to untangle the strap. The silk was unlike anything he had handled before. It was not the gossamer of a garden spider, fragile and sticky. It was tough, almost wiry, with a tensile strength that made him think of fishing line or surgical suture. It left a faint residue on his fingers, a proteinaceous film that smelled faintly of ammonia and something else, something organic and faintly sweet. He was about to call out for Maya, to show her the discovery, when the sound stopped. It was not gradual. It was sudden, as though someone had thrown a switch. The insect chorus that had been building toward the dawn crescendo simply ceased, mid-chirp, mid-buzz, mid-whir. The frogs stopped their throaty bellowing. The birds, which had been beginning their morning rituals, fell silent. Even the ever-present sound of condensation dripping from leaf to leaf seemed to pause, the drops hanging suspended for a fraction of a second longer than gravity should allow before releasing with a sound that was somehow louder, more deliberate, more ominous than all the noise that had preceded it. Elias stood frozen, his hand still raised to the silk line, his camera dangling from its strap. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was the silence of a room where someone has just walked in and stood behind you. It was the silence of a held breath. It was the silence of something that had been waiting, that had been listening, that had now received the message that Elias had sent with his carelessness. He became aware, slowly, of his own heartbeat. It was thunderous, a drum solo in the absolute quiet, and he understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins that his heartbeat was not private. It was a vibration. It was a signal. It was a declaration of presence in a space where presence was the only currency that mattered. "Kalo," he whispered, the word barely audible even to himself. "Kalo, I think I." He did not finish the sentence. Above him, in the canopy that had been still a moment before, something moved. Not a monkey, not a bird. Something heavier, something that displaced the air with a sound like wet leather being stretched, something that caused the branches to bend and creak under a weight that had no business being in the trees. He saw a shadow pass across a shaft of morning light, a silhouette that was all wrong for anything he knew. Too many segments, too many angles, a geometry of limbs that seemed to fold and unfold in ways that violated the basic principles of vertebrate anatomy. Elias did not run. He could not run. His legs had become stone, his feet rooted to the red earth by a terror so profound that it bypassed his conscious mind entirely and spoke directly to the ancient, reptilian core of his brain. He stood there, hand on the silk line, camera at his side, and watched as the shadow passed again, closer this time, close enough that he could hear the individual hairs on whatever body part was brushing against the bark, a sound like 1,000 toothbrushes scrubbing against wood. The silence held, the vibration had been sent, and something, somewhere in the green cathedral of the Itchery, had received it. Elias did not know how long he stood there before the others found him. It might have been seconds, it might have been hours. Time had become liquid, pooling around his ankles like a rising flood. When Priya's voice came, sharp with worry, it sounded like it was coming from another world. "Elias, Elias, what are you doing? We've been calling you for 10 minutes. He turned his head slowly, mechanically, and saw her standing at the edge of the camp clearing, her medical bag in one hand and a cup of instant coffee in the other. Behind her, Derek was shouldering his rifle, and Maya was emerging from her tent, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail, her field notebook already in her hand. They looked so normal. They looked so safe. They looked like people who had not yet learned that the world they inhabited was not the world they believed in. "The line," Elias said, his voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "I touched the line." What line? Derek asked, walking over with the casual arrogance of a man who trusted his rifle more than his instincts. Elias pointed. The silk filament was still there, still vibrating with a faint, residual energy, still carrying its message to whatever nodes it connected to. Derek leaned in, his nose wrinkling. Spider silk, Maya said, pushing past him. She pulled out a pair of forceps from her belt and touched the filament, testing its tension. High tensile. This is serious engineering. Whatever produced this is not a garden-variety arachnid. I told you, Kahlo said. He had appeared from somewhere, silent as smoke, his face a mask of controlled dread. I told you about the lines. I told you about the walking. You touched it. You sent the vibration. Send it where? Priya asked, her medical mind seeking a rational explanation. It's just silk. It's a structural element. Spiders don't have central nervous systems that process long-distance signals. This spider does, Kahlo said. Or perhaps it is not one spider. Perhaps it is many, all connected by the silk, all feeling what the others feel. A network. A web that is not just in the trees but in the ground, in the roots, in the air itself. That's not biology, Maya said, but there was a tremor in her voice that had not been there before. That's something else. It is the J'Ba Fofi, Kahlo said simply. And now it knows you are here, not as visitors, not as travelers, as prey. Elias looked at the silk line, still vibrating with the memory of his touch. He looked at his team, their faces transitioning from confusion to concern to the first, faint edges of fear. He looked at the canopy, where the shadow had passed, where something with too many legs and too much patience was listening, was waiting, was planning. The false sense of security was over. The garden had awakened, and the harvest was about to begin. The argument started before they had even finished their instant coffee, and it continued as they broke camp with a haste that was part efficiency, part panic. Derek was adamant that they should leave immediately, following the same trail they had used to reach the ridge, moving fast and making noise. Whatever's out there, he said, his hand never straying far from the rifle, it's an animal. Animals don't like noise and fire. We make ourselves big, we make ourselves loud, and we get the hell out. Kahlo shook his head, his expression closed and unreadable. You cannot outrun what is already watching you. You cannot scare what has no fear. The J'Ba Fofi does not hunt like a leopard. It does not charge and retreat. It waits. It plans. It builds. Builds what? Maya asked. She had been inspecting the silk line with her field loupe, documenting its diameter and tensile properties in her notebook with a diligence that Elias recognized as denial, the scientific method as shield against the irrational. Traps, Kahlo said, pits, tripwires, a garden of death that stretches for miles. I have told you. My grandfather told me. The Lloyd men died not because they were weak, but because they walked where they were meant to walk. They stepped where the ground invited them to step. Pit traps, Priya interjected, her medical skepticism warring with something deeper, something ancestral. Like a trapdoor spider. Those exist, sure, but they're the size of a silver dollar. You're talking about something that could trap a human. I am talking about something that has trapped humans before. Many humans, over many years. Elias looked around the camp, really looked at it for the first time since they had arrived. The flat shelf of ground where they had pitched their tents seemed, in retrospect, too flat. The soil was compressed in a circular pattern, as though heavy weights had been placed there repeatedly, season after season. The trees around the clearing were scarred at chest height, not with the random gouges of falling branches but with parallel lines, evenly spaced, that looked like the marks of something being tied and untied, stretched and relaxed. And the leaf litter, God, the leaf litter. He had assumed it was natural, the endless accumulation of tropical decomposition, but now he saw that it was too uniform, too evenly distributed. In some places it was thick, almost fluffy, inviting a footstep. In others it was thin, revealing the packed earth beneath. The pattern was not random. It was designed. "Kahlo," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "how big is this garden?" The guide did not answer immediately. He walked to the edge of the camp, his bare feet making no sound on the humus, and crouched low, his fingers tracing the boundary between the thick leaf litter and the thin. "The ridge is the center," he said. "The ridge and the slopes around it. Maybe 200 acres, maybe more. The mother has been here since before my grandfather was born. She grows, she expands, she improves." "Improves?" Derek laughed, a harsh barking sound. "It's a spider, not an architect." "Is it?" Maya asked. She had moved 10 meters from the camp and was standing at the base of a massive ceiba tree, her head tilted back, her eyes scanning the canopy. "Elias, come here, bring the camera." He went, moving with a caution that felt absurd and necessary in equal measure. Maya pointed upward, and Elias followed her finger with his lens, zooming in on a section of canopy 40 feet above their heads. At first, he saw nothing but the usual tangle of lianas and epiphytes, the green chaos of a healthy rainforest canopy. Then his eye caught a pattern. Threads, dozens of them, hundreds. They crisscrossed between the branches in a geometry that was too regular to be accidental, forming a lattice that caught the morning light and turned it into a web of spectral gleams. The threads were not all the same thickness. Some were as fine as the one Elias had brushed against. Others were thicker, almost rope-like, sagging slightly under their own weight. And woven into the lattice at intervals of every few meters were structures that Elias could only describe as platforms, flat sections of woven silk and leaf, some empty, some holding dark shapes that might have been caches of food or nesting material. "My God," Elias breathed, "it's a city, it's a whole city up there." "Not a city," Kahlo said, appearing beside them so silently that Elias jumped. "A farm. Those platforms are the silos, those dark shapes are the stores. She keeps her prey alive for days, sometimes weeks, wrapped in silk that numbs the nerves and preserves the blood. She does not kill quickly. She kills slowly. She kills when she is hungry. She kills when her young are hungry. She is a farmer and the forest is her barn." Priya made a sound that was halfway between a sob and a gag. "That's not possible. No spider has that kind of behavior. Trapdoor spiders make simple burrows, orb weavers make spirals. Social spiders make communal nests. But farming, planning, storage, that's cognition." "It is evolution," Kahlo said simply. "Millions of years in a place where food is scarce and competition is fierce. The J'Ba Fofi did not become what she is by accident. She became what she is because the forest demanded it, because the forest shaped her." Derek had been pacing the perimeter of the camp, his rifle held across his chest, his eyes scanning the trees with the hypervigilance of a soldier who has learned that the enemy is never where you expect. "Fine," he said, stopping abruptly. "So it's smart. So it's got a big web. That doesn't change the physics. Bullets still kill things. I'm going to find a clear line of sight to the nearest big thread highway, and I'm going to wait. When whatever made that web comes down to investigate, I'm going to put a .375 through its cephalothorax." "Derek, no," Elias started. "Derek, yes," the former ranger snapped. "I'm not going to sit here like a fly waiting to be wrapped up. I'm going to hunt the hunter. That's what rangers do." He turned and marched toward the edge of the ridge, his boots crunching through the leaf litter with a rhythmic regularity that made Kahlo wince. The guide started to call out a warning, then stopped, his face settling into an expression of weary resignation. "Let him go," Kahlo said softly. "He will learn or he will not." Derek had gone perhaps 30 meters when they heard the first crack. It was not the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. It was the sound of something giving way beneath weight, a structural failure that was followed by a grunt of surprise, and then a wet thud and a cry that was cut short by the sudden, shocking sound of impact. "Derek," Priya shouted, breaking into a run. "Stop," Kahlo grabbed her arm with a strength that belied his small frame. "Do not run, do not follow his path. The ground is not safe. He's hurt, we have to." "He is not hurt," Kahlo said, his voice flat. "He is taken." They could hear Derek now, not words but sounds. A series of grunts and gasps, and the desperate, scrabbling noise of fingernails against something smooth and resistant. Elias forced himself to move forward, placing each foot with the care of a man walking on ice, following Derek's boot prints in the leaf litter. The prints were deep, pressed into the ground with the confidence of a man who believed the earth was solid. And then, 10 meters ahead, the prints simply stopped. In their place was a circle of disturbed vegetation, a roughly oval patch where the leaves had been displaced, revealing a gaping hole in the forest floor. Elias approached it slowly, his camera forgotten, his entire consciousness narrowed to the diameter of that hole. It was about 6 feet across, its edges ringed with roots that had been cut or chewed smooth, their ends painted with a sheen of silk that held the surrounding soil in place. The interior walls were lined with the same material, a layer of pale, fibrous silk that glistened with moisture and smelled of rot and something else, something coppery and familiar. The pit was deep. Elias could not see the bottom, but he could hear Derek, somewhere down there, still making sounds, still fighting. "Derek," Elias called down. "Derek, can you hear me?" The sound stopped. For a moment, there was only the drip of water and the faint, rhythmic scraping of something moving below. "Elias?" Derek's voice came back, distorted by depth and terror. "Elias, I can't move. Something's wrapped around my legs. It's warm. Jesus, it's warm and it's tight and I can't feel my feet anymore." "Don't struggle," Kahlo said, appearing at Elias' side. "The more you struggle, the tighter it gets. The silk is designed for that. It responds to movement. It is a protein that contracts when agitated." "Get me out," Derek screamed. "For the love of God, get me out of here." Elias looked at Kahlo, desperation in his eyes. How do we get him out?" Kahlo shook his head. "We do not from the top. The pit is designed to prevent escape. The walls are too smooth, too steep. The silk is too strong. The only way out is the way the mother allows." "Then what do we do?" "We wait," Kahlo said. "We wait and we watch and we learn." They waited. It was the most agonizing hour of Elias' life. They sat at the edge of the pit, unable to look away, unable to do anything but listen as Derek's struggles grew weaker, and his voice faded from screams to whimpers to silence. They heard the silk moving, a wet, sliding sound like 1,000 tongues licking bone. They heard Derek's breathing, which became shallow and then stopped. And they heard, finally, the sound of something ascending from the depths, something that moved with a deliberateness that was more terrifying than any sudden attack could have been. Elias saw it first. A leg. One leg emerging from the hole like the mast of a ship breaking the surface of a dark sea. It was segmented, jointed, covered in a dense pelt of reddish-brown hair that caught the light and turned it bronze. The leg was as thick as Elias' wrist, and it ended in a claw that looked like a blackened fishhook, curved and sharp, and designed for purchase on surfaces that should have been impossible to climb. Another leg followed, then another, then the body itself, a mass of chitin and muscle that seemed to unfold from the pit like a nightmare origami, a cephalothorax the size of a melon and an abdomen that was larger, swollen, segmented, pulsing with an internal rhythm that Elias recognized as digestion. The J'Ba Fofi, the spider that was not supposed to exist, the monster that was not a monster but a biological reality so far outside the parameters of acceptable zoology that its very presence seemed to invalidate everything Elias had ever learned about the natural world. It paused at the rim of the pit, its 8 eyes, arranged in 2 rows of 4, each eye a gleaming black orb that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it, scanning the clearing. Elias felt the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure, a touch that was almost intimate in its thoroughness. The spider was smelling him, tasting him with organs he could not see, processing his chemical signature and comparing it to some internal database of prey and threat and opportunity. Then it moved, Not toward them. Elias would have screamed, would have run, would have done something, but away, dragging something behind it, something wrapped in silk, something that had been Derek. They watched in silence as the spider disappeared into the canopy, its burden bouncing gently against the bark as it climbed with a grace that defied its bulk. It moved along one of the thick silk highways, following a path that had been laid down for exactly this purpose, and within moments it was gone, absorbed into the green labyrinth above. "Derek," Priya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh God, Derek." "He is not dead," Kahlo said. "Not yet. The mother does not kill quickly. She keeps them fresh. She keeps them alive until the feeding, sometimes days, sometimes longer." "How do you know?" Maya asked, her voice hollow. "Because my grandfather told me. Because he heard the Lloyds screaming for 3 days before the screaming stopped. Because he was the one who found the remains afterward. The bones picked clean. The skulls intact. The silk empty." Elias felt his stomach heave, and he turned away just in time to vomit into the bushes. The bile was bitter and hot, and it burned his throat, but it was nothing compared to the cold, churning horror in his gut. He had come to the itchery to find a story. He had found something else. He had found a predator that had evolved beyond the simple calculus of eat or be eaten into something far more sophisticated, far more patient, far more intelligent. He had found a farmer, and he was the crop. "We need to understand the layout," Maya said, her scientific mind clawing its way back from the abyss of panic. "If this is a managed landscape, it has patterns. It has rules. We need to map the tripwires, identify the pit traps, find the safe corridors." "There are no safe corridors," Kahlo said, "but there are safer corridors. Paths the mother uses for her own movement, places where she does not place traps because she needs them for travel." "Then show us," Elias said, wiping his mouth. "Show us how to read this place, because if we don't learn, we're all going to end up like Derek." Kahlo nodded, and for the first time since the argument began, Elias saw something like respect in the guide's eyes. "Then we study," Kahlo said. "We study and we move slowly, and we do not, under any circumstances, make a pattern with our feet." They spent the next 2 hours in a nightmare of education, crawling on their bellies through the undergrowth, learning to read the subtle signs that distinguished solid ground from disguised death. Kahlo showed them how to spot the tripwires, the faint shimmer of silk at certain angles, the slight disturbance in the leaf litter where a line had been anchored, the telltale absence of vegetation in corridors that were kept clear for vibration transmission. He showed them the pit traps, which were everywhere, not just the one that had taken Derek, but dozens, scores, a network of holes that made the ridge into a minefield of silk-lined graves. Some were small, no bigger than a rabbit burrow, designed for the young spiders to practice their hunting. Others were massive, 10 feet across, their depths lost in shadow, their walls glistening with the accumulated moisture of years. And he showed them the tripwire canopy itself, not just the single line Elias had brushed against, but the entire system. It was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. The lines ran between trees in a 3-dimensional lattice that covered the ground, the understory, and the canopy. Some were horizontal, designed to detect movement along the forest floor. Others were vertical, hanging like curtains between the trunks, ready to brush against anything that tried to pass. Still others were diagonal, stretched at angles that seemed calculated to catch specific types of prey, the vertical leaps of monkeys, the horizontal dashes of ground birds, the slow, deliberate movements of the unwitting human. "Each line is a sensor," Kahlo explained, crouching beside a particularly thick strand that ran at knee-height between 2 saplings. "When it vibrates, the vibration travels along the silk to the nodes. The nodes are the junctions where many lines meet. From there, the signal travels to the mother. She knows where you are. She knows how fast you are moving. She knows how heavy you are. She knows if you are alone or in a group." "How?" Maya asked, her notebook out despite everything, her pencil scratching furiously. "How does she process that much information?" "I do not know," Kahlo admitted. But I know she does. I have seen her respond to a triggered line within minutes, moving across hundreds of meters of canopy to reach a prey that she could not possibly have seen or heard. She feels the forest the way you feel your own skin. They mapped as best they could, sketching crude diagrams in Maya's notebook and Elia's field journal. The ridge was a spider's web in the most literal sense, a radial pattern of thick silk, highways running from the center to the perimeter, with concentric rings of tripwires and pit traps between them. The center was the densest, the most dangerous, a zone of overlapping triggers and hidden pits that Kahlo called the heart. The edges were less dense, but no less dangerous, because the mother had learned to concentrate her traps at the boundaries of her territory, where prey was most likely to enter or attempt to escape. It is not just a web, Elias realized, looking at their sketches. It's a circuit board, it's a nervous system. The whole ridge is one organism and the spider is the brain. Yes, Kahlo said, and we are the electricity. We are the signal that tells the brain where to send the body. Every step we take, every breath we make, every heartbeat, it all travels through the ground, through the roots, through the silk. We are not hiding from her. We are talking to her. And everything we say tells her exactly where we are. The realization settled over them like a cold fog. They were not explorers lost in the jungle. They were mice in a maze designed by a genius. They were not fighting for survival against a wild animal. They were resisting the inevitable harvest of a farmer who had been perfecting her craft for longer than human civilization had existed. And somewhere above them in the canopy that was both roof and prison, the J'Ba Fofi was listening. She was patient, she was thorough, and she was coming. Elias looked at the pit where Derek had fallen. The leaves were already settling back into place, camouflaging the hole with a patience that matched the spider's own. In an hour, maybe less, the trap would be invisible again, ready for the next victim. And the silk lines would continue to vibrate with the memory of their passage, carrying news of their presence to the mother, who would adjust her plans accordingly. We need to find the edges, Elias said, the places where her web ends. The river, Kahlo said. The river is the boundary. The water does not carry vibration. If we can reach the river, we can escape her senses. How far? 3 kilometers, maybe 4, through the heart of the garden. Elias looked at Priya, who was pale and shaking but still upright. He looked at Maya, whose scientific curiosity had been replaced by a grim determination that was, in its own way, more frightening than despair. He looked at Kahlo, who had known all along what they were walking into and had come anyway, driven by a debt that Elias was only beginning to understand. Then we go, Elias said, belly to the earth, no rhythm, no pattern, we move like ghosts. Kahlo nodded. Ghosts, he agreed, or worms, the things she does not eat. They gathered what they could, water bottles, protein bars, the medical kit, Maya's notebook, and prepared to move. As they did, Elias noticed something that made his blood run colder than it already was. The silk lines around the camp were vibrating. Not from their movements, they had been still for minutes, but from something else, something distant, something massive. She is coming, Kahlo said, following Elias' gaze. She has finished with the big man, she has stored him, and now she is coming for the rest of the harvest. How long? Elias asked. Minutes, maybe less. Then move, Elias said, move now. They crawled. They crawled like worms, like snakes, like things that had forgotten how to walk. They spread their arms and legs wide, distributing their weight across the maximum surface area, avoiding the lines that Kahlo pointed out, skirting the pits that yawned like mouths in the earth. They moved without rhythm, without pattern, each of them making choices that were deliberately random. Left, then right, then back, then forward, trying to become noise instead of signal. Behind them, the canopy stirred. Something was moving through the trees, something that displaced the air in waves and caused the leaves to shiver with a fear that was older than language. Elias did not look back. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought and went straight to the marrow, that if he looked back, he would see something that would stop his heart. So he crawled, they all crawled, and the garden watched and waited and planned its next move. They had crawled for what felt like hours, but was probably no more than 20 minutes when Maya made the mistake. It was a small thing, a moment of inattention, a hand placed too far to the left in an attempt to avoid a visible tripwire. Her palm came down on a patch of leaf litter that looked no different from any other patch of leaf litter, but the sound it made was wrong, a hollow, resonant thump rather than the soft crunch of organic matter over solid ground. Elias heard it before he saw it, a frequency of emptiness that traveled up his spine and lodged in the base of his skull. "Maya," he hissed, "don't move." She froze, her hand still pressed into the leaves, her body suspended in the awkward posture of a crawling woman caught mid-stride. Her eyes were wide, staring at the ground beneath her palm with an expression of dawning comprehension that was almost worse than fear. She knew, before Kahlo said a word, what she had found. "Slowly," Kahlo whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient hum of the forest which had somehow returned after their departure from the ridge, as though the jungle itself were catching its breath between acts of violence. "Move your hand back. Do not press down. Do not shift your weight." Maya began to withdraw her hand, millimeter by millimeter, her muscles trembling with the effort of controlled movement. The leaves rustled, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the relative quiet. Elias watched, his own body forgotten, his breath held so long that his vision began to spot with black. The line was triggered by the vibration of the rustling leaves, not by pressure on the ground itself. Elias saw it happen. A filament no thicker than a human hair, stretched between two low branches 3 feet above Maya's head, began to oscillate with a frequency that was almost musical. The vibration traveled along the line, visible as a shimmer in the air, moving toward a junction point in a nearby tree where a dozen other lines converged in a knot of silk that looked almost like a flower, or a gland, or an organ. "It knows," Kahlo said. "It knows where we are. It knows she is the one who touched the ground. It knows her weight, her rhythm, her fear." "How do we?" "Run," Kahlo said, and there was a terrible finality in the word. "Run now, scatter, no pattern, no direction, be noise." They ran. There was no time for crawling, no time for caution, no time for the careful, deliberate movements that Kahlo had taught them. The fear had become physical, a chemical flood that overrode every higher function and reduced them to animals, to prey, to things that moved on instinct alone. Elias ran to the left, his arms windmilling, his feet finding purchase on roots and stones with a luck that he did not question. Priya ran to the right, her medical bag bouncing against her hip, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Maya ran straight ahead, back toward the ridge, her field notebook clutched to her chest like a talisman. And Kahlo did not run. Kahlo stood his ground, his bare feet planted wide, his eyes fixed on the canopy above Maya's head. "Kahlo," Elias screamed, "come on." "I am the distraction," Kahlo said, and his voice was calm, almost serene. "I am the noise. Go, go now, do not look back." Elias ran. He ran through undergrowth that tore at his skin, through vines that wrapped around his ankles like living things, through mud that sucked at his boots with the hungry persistence of quicksand. He ran without looking back, because he knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that what was happening behind him was something that would stop his heart if he saw it. But he heard it, God, he heard it. The sound began as a whisper, a displacement of air that was more felt than heard, a pressure change that made his ears pop and his sinuses ache. Then it became a rush, a sound like 1,000 sheets of paper being torn simultaneously, a percussive violence that spoke of mass and velocity and intent. And then it became a scream, Maya's scream, a sound that began as a cry of surprise and escalated into something that no human throat should have been able to produce, a frequency of agony that seemed to resonate in the bones of Elias' skull and the enamel of his teeth. He heard the snap, the wet, muscular snap of something tensioned releasing, followed by the thud, not of a body hitting the ground, but of a body being lifted, being snatched upward with a force that made the air itself shudder. He heard the branches breaking, the leaves raining down, the silk singing like a harp string as it took the weight of a human being and transferred it to the canopy above. And then, because he was weak, because he was human, because some part of him needed to see in order to believe, Elias looked back. He saw the leg first. It was descending from the canopy like the boom of a crane, a limb of impossible length and thickness, jointed in ways that seemed to defy the basic engineering of skeletal anatomy. The leg was covered in a dense pelt of reddish-brown hair that caught the dappled sunlight and turned it into a halo of bronze and copper. At the end of the leg was a claw, a blackened hook that was wrapped around Maya's ankle with a tenderness that was more obscene than any brutality could have been. The claw was not cutting her. It was holding her. It was lifting her. And then he saw the body. The J'Ba Fofi was descending on a second line, a thick cable of silk that anchored it to the canopy above, rappelling down with a speed that was breathtaking for something so large. The cephalothorax was the size of a beach ball, a mass of chitin plates that fit together with the precision of armor, each plate edged with a fringe of hair that vibrated with the creature's own internal frequencies. The abdomen was larger, swollen, segmented, pulsing with a peristaltic rhythm that Elias recognized as digestion, as hunger, as need. But it was the underbelly that stopped his breath. As the spider descended, its body rotated slightly, exposing the ventral surface to the light, and Elias saw what the Lloyd journals had described, what the Baca stories had whispered about, what no camera had ever captured in focus. The underbelly was marked with a pattern of iridescent purple, a color that shifted and shimmered as the light changed, ranging from deep violet to electric magenta to a bruised arterial red. The pattern was not random. It was symmetrical, almost heraldic, a design that seemed to pulse with its own bioluminescence, as though the spider carried a piece of the twilight sky trapped beneath its armor. The purple mark. Maya was still screaming, but the sound was changing, becoming weaker, becoming something that was not quite human. The spider had wrapped her in silk, not the crude, tangled webbing of a garden spider, but a precise, surgical wrapping that started at her ankles and moved upward with a speed that defied comprehension. The silk was not white. It was amber, almost golden, and it glistened with a moisture that Elias knew, with a sick certainty, was an anesthetic. Maya's struggles were slowing. Her screams were becoming whimpers. Her eyes, which had been wide with terror, were beginning to glaze, to soften, to accept. "Maya," Elias screamed, but his voice was nothing against the enormity of what he was witnessing. "Maya, fight it." She did not fight. She could not fight. The silk had reached her chest now, and her arms were pinned to her sides, and her head was lolling back, and the only sign that she was still conscious was the slow, rhythmic movement of her eyes, tracking the spider as it completed its work with a deliberateness that was almost tender, almost loving. The J'Ba Fofi paused. It held Maya suspended 3 feet above the ground, wrapped in her golden cocoon, and it turned its cephalothorax toward Elias. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they locked eyes, or rather, Elias locked eyes with the 8 black orbs that stared back at him with an intelligence that was not human but was not mindless either. He saw curiosity in those eyes. He saw assessment. He saw a calculation being made, a weighing of risks and benefits, a decision about whether this particular prey was worth the expenditure of energy. Then the spider turned away. It ascended, carrying Maya with it, moving up the silk cable with a grace that was obscene in its beauty, its legs finding purchase on the bark with a precision that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Within seconds, it was gone, absorbed into the canopy, and the only evidence that it had ever been there was the swaying of a branch and the faint, lingering scent of ammonia and rot. Elias stood frozen, his body refusing to obey the commands that his mind was screaming. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. He wanted to vomit. He wanted to die. But he could do none of these things. He could only stand, staring at the empty space where Maya had been, and listen to the silence that followed her absence. Elias. Priya's voice behind him, small and broken. He turned, slowly, mechanically, and saw her standing 10 meters away, her medical bag discarded at her feet, her face a mask of shock that mirrored his own. "Did you see?" she whispered. "Did you see the purple mark?" Elias said. His voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "I saw it." "It took her," Priya said. It just took her, like she was nothing, like she was a rabbit." "She is not dead," Kahlo said. He had appeared from somewhere, moving with a silence that should have been impossible for a man who had just witnessed what they had witnessed. "Not yet. The mother stores her prey. She keeps them alive. She keeps them fresh." "For how long?" Priya demanded. "How long does she keep them?" "Days, sometimes a week. It depends on how hungry she is, how many young she has to feed." "Then we can save her," Priya said, and there was a desperate hope in her voice that was more painful than despair. "We can find where it's taking her. We can cut her out. We can." "No," Kahlo said. "We cannot. The mother does not store her prey in the canopy. She stores them in the roots, in the hollows beneath the earth, in places that only she knows." "Then what do we do?" Elias asked. "What the hell do we do?" Kahlo looked at him, and for the first time since they had entered the forest, Elias saw fear in the guide's eyes. Not the controlled, managed fear of a man who knows the dangers of his environment, but the raw, animal fear of a man who has realized that the thing he feared most is not only real, but is smarter than he is. "We understand the hunt," Kahlo said. "We understand how she thinks, because if we do not understand her, we will not survive her." They moved deeper into the forest. If deeper had any meaning in a place where distance and direction seemed to have become suggestions rather than laws. Kahlo led them, not along any path but through a series of evasive maneuvers that seemed almost random. A sudden turn to the left, a backward step, a crawl through a thicket of thorny vines that tore their skin and left them bleeding. He explained as they moved, his voice a continuous whisper that was barely audible above the resumed jungle noise. "The mother does not attack all at once," he said. "She is not a lion, she is not a leopard. She does not rely on speed or strength alone. She relies on information. She relies on patience. She relies on the fact that her prey will do exactly what prey always does when it is frightened." "What does prey do?" Priya asked. "It runs," Kahlo said. "It runs in straight lines. It runs in patterns. It runs with rhythm and predictability. And every time it runs, it tells the mother exactly where it is, how fast it is moving, and how scared it is." Elias thought of Maya, running straight ahead, back toward the ridge, her footsteps falling in a desperate, regular rhythm. He thought of himself running to the left, his arms windmilling, his feet finding purchase with a luck that was not luck at all but the randomness that had saved him. He thought of Priya, running to the right, her movements less predictable, less rhythmic, perhaps the reason she was still alive. "The tripwires," Elias said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "They're not just traps, they're sensors, they're a network." "Yes," Kahlo said. "Every line she has stretched between the trees is a nerve ending. Every vibration is a signal. And she has been stretching these lines for decades, for centuries, mapping this valley with a precision that no human cartographer could match. She knows where the solid ground is. She knows where the pits are. She knows where the safe paths are, and she knows where the dangerous paths are. And she knows, she absolutely knows, that when her prey is frightened, it will run along the safe paths." "Because the safe paths are the ones without traps," Priya said. "No," Kahlo said. "Because the safe paths are the ones she has made to look safe. The paths without visible tripwires. The paths with solid ground. The paths that lead." He stopped. They had reached a clearing, a space where the canopy was thinner and the sunlight reached the forest floor in thick, golden columns. The clearing was beautiful, almost idyllic, a carpet of moss and ferns that looked like the floor of a cathedral, and at the center of the clearing was a tree. It was a ceiba, ancient and massive, its trunk wider than a car, its buttress roots spreading outward like the walls of a fortress. The trunk was hollow, a dark opening at its base that led into a cavity that seemed to extend downward rather than upward, into the earth rather than into the sky. And around the base of the tree, arranged in a perfect circle, were the tripwires. Hundreds of them, thousands. A dense web of silk that covered the ground in a mesh so thick that it looked like a carpet of silver, catching the sunlight and turning it into a kaleidoscope of color. The lines ran from the tree to the surrounding forest in every direction, forming a radial pattern that was both beautiful and terrifying in its complexity. "The heart," Kahlo whispered, "the center of the web, the place where she processes the information, the place where she decides." "Decides what?" Elias asked. "Who lives, who dies, who is stored, who is eaten." They stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the tree and its web of lines, and Elias felt a strange, dissociative calm settle over him. It was the calm of a man who has reached the limits of his understanding and found, on the other side, a kind of terrible clarity. The J'Ba Fofi was not a monster. It was not a demon. It was a biological entity that had evolved to exploit a specific ecological niche, and that niche was the management of prey in a complex, multi-layered environment. It was a farmer. It was an engineer. It was, in its own way, a genius. And they were the crop. "The psychology of the hunt," Elias said, his voice distant, almost philosophical. "She doesn't just kill, she manipulates, she herds, she uses our fear against us." "Yes," Kahlo said. "The more you run, the more you trigger. The more you trigger, the more she knows. The more she knows, the more she can predict. And the more she can predict, the more certain your death becomes." "Then we don't run," Priya said. "We don't trigger the lines. We move slowly, carefully, unpredictably. We become noise instead of signal." "It is too late for that," Kahlo said. "We have already sent our signals. She knows our patterns. She knows our rhythms. She knows that when we are frightened, we run. She knows that Maya ran straight. She knows that Elias ran left. She knows that you, doctor, ran right. And she is adjusting her web accordingly." "Adjusting how?" Elias asked. Kahlo pointed to the radial lines around the tree. Even as they watched, some of the lines were vibrating, not from their presence but from something else, something distant. The vibrations traveled along the silk to the tree, where they converged in the hollow trunk, and Elias imagined. He could not help but imagine. The spider inside, processing the information, updating her model of the forest, calculating the optimal placement of her next trap. "She is moving the lines," Kahlo said. "She is redirecting the tripwires. She is creating new corridors that lead to new pits. She is adapting to our movements. She is learning." "That's not possible, Maya." "No, not Maya," Priya said. "Spiders can't learn that fast. They can't reconfigure their webs in real time." "This spider can," Kahlo said. "This spider has been learning for longer than your civilization has existed. This spider has watched humans come and go for generations. She has studied us. She has experimented on us. She knows our psychology better than we know it ourselves." Elias felt the last of his rational defenses crumble. He had come to the Itchery as a filmmaker, a storyteller, a man who believed that the world was explainable if you just had the right angle and the right lighting. He had found something else. He had found a predator that was not just physically superior but intellectually superior, a creature that had transcended the simple instincts of hunger and reproduction to become something that could only be described as malevolent. Not because it hated them, but because it understood them, because it could predict their every move, because it had reduced them from individuals to data points in a calculation that was as old as the forest itself. "She knows we will try to save Maya," Elias said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She knows we won't leave her. She's using Maya as bait. Yes, Kahlo said. Then we don't go after Maya, Priya said, her voice trembling. We go around, we avoid the traps, we find the river. She knows that too, Kahlo said. She knows that some of us will try to save the captured one and some of us will try to escape. She has prepared for both. The paths to the river are the most heavily trapped. The paths to the storage sites are the most heavily guarded. There is no safe option. There is only the least dangerous option. Which is? Kahlo was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, a whisper that seemed to come from the earth itself. The nest, he said, the place she does not expect us to go, the place where she is most vulnerable, the place where her young are. The nest of yellow, Elias said, remembering the Lloyd journals, the cryptic notation that had brought them here. The breeding ground. Yes, Kahlo said, the breeding ground, the heart of the heart, the place where the mother keeps her most precious cargo, and the place where, if we are very clever and very lucky, we might find a way to turn her own psychology against her. How? Priya asked. Because every farmer, Kahlo said, every farmer who has ever lived has one weakness. They care more for their crop than for their own life. And the J'Ba Fofi, for all her intelligence, for all her patience, for all her terrible beauty, she is still a mother. And mothers will die for their young. He turned away from the clearing, from the tree with its web of lines, from the hollow that led down into the earth. He began to move, not crawling now but walking, placing his feet with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial, following a path that only he could see. Come, he said, we have very little time. The mother has finished with Maya, she has stored her, and now she is coming for the rest. The only question is whether we will be ready when she arrives. Elias and Priya exchanged a glance, and in that glance Elias saw all the things they had never said to each other, all the love and resentment and hope and disappointment that had defined their relationship. He saw, too, the fear that was consuming them both, the fear that was not just of dying, but of dying in a way that was so far outside the bounds of human dignity that it could not be named, only experienced. They followed Kahlo. They had no choice. The forest had become a maze, and the maze had become a mind, and the mind was hunting them with a patience that made their own terror seem like a fleeting thing, a candle flame in a hurricane. Behind them, the lines continued to vibrate, carrying news of their passage to the mother, who was listening, who was planning, who was coming. Kahlo led them through a maze of undergrowth that seemed to tighten around them with every meter, the vegetation growing denser and more hostile as they moved away from the central clearing. Thorns tore at their clothes and skin, leaving ribbons of blood that attracted clouds of biting flies. The humidity increased until breathing felt like drowning, each inhalation bringing a lungful of water vapor that was almost too thick to process. And everywhere, above and below and between, were the lines. They had become impossible to avoid. The tripwire network had thickened as they approached what Kahlo called the inner garden, a zone where the mother's control was absolute and her defenses were most elaborate. The lines were no longer simple filaments stretched between trees. They had become a three-dimensional lattice that filled the air like a fisherman's net, catching the light in ways that made the forest seem to shimmer with a malevolent iridescence. Some lines hung vertically like curtains, their lower ends anchored in the soil by clumps of silk that had hardened into resinous nodules. Others ran diagonally across open spaces, forming tripwires that would catch anything moving at any height. And still others were almost invisible, threads so fine that they were detectable only by the way they refracted light, creating faint rainbows in the air where no rainbows should have been. "We are close," Kahlo whispered, his voice barely audible above the buzz of insects that had returned in force, as though the mother's attention were elsewhere, focused on some other part of her domain. "The nest is near. I can smell it." Elias could smell it too. It was a sweet, cloying odor that cut through the usual perfume of rot and decay, a smell that reminded him of overripe bananas and fermentation, and something else, something biological and warm that spoke of living things in vast numbers. It was the smell of the eggs multiplied by 1,000, by 10,000, a concentrated essence of arachnid reproduction that made his stomach clench and his throat tighten. How many? Priya asked, her medical instincts warring with her horror. How many young? A mature female J'Ba Fofi, Kahlo said, can produce 3,000 eggs in a single season, and she lives for 30 years. This mother has been here for at least 50. Do the mathematics. Elias did not want to do the mathematics. The numbers were too large, too abstract, too terrifying in their implications. A mother spider with 50 years of breeding, producing thousands of offspring every season, raising them in a protected environment with abundant food, the food being whatever hapless creatures wandered into her web, including humans. The scale of the operation was beyond comprehension. The itchery was not a wilderness. It was a farm, and they were walking into the barn. The tree appeared suddenly, as though the forest had been concealing it until the last possible moment. It was a giant, a ceiba that must have been 1,000 years old, its trunk wider than a house, its buttress roots extending outward in walls of wood that were taller than a man. The trunk was not solid. It was hollow, eaten away from within by some combination of rot and design, creating a cavity that gaped like a mouth in the side facing them. The opening was roughly circular, about 6 feet in diameter, and its edges were lined with silk, not the rough, haphazard webbing of a natural spider's lair, but a smooth, almost architectural rim that had been reinforced and maintained with obvious care. And the opening was yellow. Not the yellow of sunlight or flowers, but a deeper, more visceral yellow, the color of egg yolks and old bone, and the fatty tissue that Priya had described in her anatomy classes. It pulsed, faintly, with an inner luminescence that seemed to come from the cavity itself, as though the tree were filled with something that glowed with its own biological light. The nest of yellow, Kahlo said, and his voice was not just reverent but afraid, a tone that Elias had never heard from the guide before. The breeding ground, the heart of the mother's power. It looks like a way in, Priya said, her voice trembling. A shelter, a place to hide. That is what it is meant to look like, Kahlo said. That is the trap. The mother does not guard her young with walls and barriers. She guards them with invitation. She makes the nest look like safety, like refuge, like the only place in the forest where a frightened animal might find protection. And when they enter, they find not safety but the brood, and the brood is always hungry. Elias stared at the yellow opening, his mind racing through possibilities and options with a speed that felt desperate. They could not go back. The tripwires behind them had multiplied, and he could see the vibrations traveling along the lines, converging on their position like the threads of a tightening noose. They could not go sideways. The undergrowth was impassable, a wall of thorns and vines that would take hours to penetrate, hours they did not have. The only directions available were forward into the tree or upward into the canopy where the mother's highways ran. "What if we don't enter?" he asked. "What if we just stay here at the entrance?" "The young ones feel us," Kahlo said. "They feel our vibrations through the wood. They feel our heartbeats. They know we are here. They are waiting." Waiting for what? For us to make a mistake, for us to enter, for us to become food. As if to punctuate his words, a sound came from inside the tree. It was a soft, rustling sound, like dry leaves being stirred by a gentle breeze, but there was no breeze. The air was still, oppressively still, and the sound was coming from the hollow itself, from the darkness beyond the yellow glow. It was the sound of movement, of many small things moving in unison, of a multitude responding to a stimulus that the humans could not perceive. Elias stepped closer, drawn by a terrible curiosity that he could not suppress. The yellow glow was not uniform. It was composed of thousands of individual points of light, each one a tiny, luminous sphere that seemed to float in the darkness like a constellation of 6 stars. and as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw what the light was coming from. Eggs, thousands of eggs. Millions perhaps, though the number was beyond counting. They were arranged in clusters, each cluster attached to the interior walls of the hollow by strands of silk that held them in place like grapes on a vine. The eggs were small, no larger than the peanut-sized specimens they had found earlier, but they were more numerous than Elias could have imagined, covering every surface in a carpet of pale yellow that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. And among the eggs, moving between them, were the hatchlings. They were small, no bigger than a thumbnail, but they were already formed, already complete, already predatory. Their bodies were pale, almost translucent, their internal organs visible as dark smudges beneath the thin carapace of their exoskeletons. Their legs were long and spindly, disproportionate to their bodies, and they moved with a jerky, mechanical grace that was both fascinating and revolting. They were not attacking the eggs. They were tending them, touching them with their forelegs, arranging them in patterns that seemed to have purpose, adjusting the silk bindings that held them in place. "My God," Priya whispered. "They're farming too, even the young ones. It's not just instinct, it's culture." "It is biology," Kahlo said, "but biology on a scale that you do not understand. The young ones are not just offspring. They are extensions of the mother. They feel what she feels. They see what she sees. They are her eyes and ears and fingers, spread through the forest in numbers that make her awareness total." "How Maya know Maya was gone?" Priya asked. "How do they communicate?" "Through the silk," Kahlo said. "Through vibrations, through chemical signals in the air. The mother does not need to be present to control her brood. She is always present. She is in every thread, every egg, every hatchling. She is the web, and the web is her." Elias felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, and he reached out to steady himself against the tree's bark. The bark was warm, warmer than it should have been, and he realized with a start that the warmth was coming from inside the hollow, from the metabolic heat of millions of tiny bodies packed into a confined space. The tree was not just a shelter. It was an incubator. It was a nursery, and the nursery was alive with a purpose that transcended any individual spider. "They know we're here," Elias said, his hand still pressed against the warm bark. "I can feel it. They're responding to my touch." "Yes," Kahlo said. "They feel your heartbeat through the wood. They feel your warmth. They feel your fear. And they are transmitting that information to the mother. They are telling her exactly where you are, exactly how scared you are, exactly how close you are to breaking." "Then we move away," Priya said. "We don't touch the tree, we don't touch anything. We find another way." "There is no other way," Kahlo said. "The mother has herded us here. This is where she wants us. This is the final trap." "Then we fight," Elias said, and there was a desperate edge to his voice that surprised him. "We have fire, we have knives, we have Derek's rifle, we burn the nest. We kill the young. We force her to choose between defending her brood and hunting us." Kahlo looked at him, and there was something in the guide's eyes that might have been pity, or might have been admiration, or might have been both. "You would burn the nest?" he asked. "If it gives us a chance to escape, yes." "And if the fire draws the mother? If the heat and the smoke and the screams of the burning young bring her in a rage that no human has ever survived?" "Then we run while she's distracted," Elias said. "We run toward the river. We run while she's dealing with us." "Us?" Kahlo asked quietly. Elias hesitated. The question hung in the humid air like a challenge, and Elias felt the weight of it pressing down on him with a physical force. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but he did know. He knew exactly what Kahlo meant. "I told you before," Kahlo said. "The only way to confuse the mother is to create a vibration that is bigger than us. A noise that makes her think a larger prey has entered her web. Something that draws her attention completely, that makes her abandon her other plans and focus on the new threat." "A distraction," Elias whispered. "A sacrifice," Kahlo corrected. "One of us must become the noise. One of us must run and shout and trigger every line in her garden. One of us must become the prey that is too big to ignore, too tempting to resist. And while she comes for that one, the others must crawl toward the river, belly to the earth. No rhythm, no pattern, like snakes, like worms. No, Priya said, her voice cracking. No, there has to be another way. We can all go. We can all crawl. She knows our numbers, Kahlo said. She knows there are 3 of us. She has counted our vibrations. She has mapped our scents. If we all crawl, she will divide her attention. She will send her young to investigate. She will create new tripwires to catch us. The only way to save 2 is to sacrifice 1. Then I'll do it, Elias said, stepping forward. I'm the leader. I'm the one who brought us here. It should be me. No, Kahlo said. It cannot be you. You are the one who must survive. You are the one who must tell the story. You are the one who must carry the warning back to the world of men. Kahlo. Listen to me, the guide said, and his voice was firm, almost commanding, the voice of a man who had accepted his fate and would not be dissuaded. My grandfather walked this ridge in 1938. He was a porter for the Lloyd expedition. He watched the white men die, one by one, and he ran. He ran like a coward, and he survived, and he spent the rest of his life in shame. He told the story to his children, and they laughed. They called him a superstitious old man. They said the jungle had made him mad. And when I was old enough to understand, he told me the truth. He told me about the mother. He told me about the web. He told me about the debt. What debt? Elias asked. The debt of the survivor, Kahlo said. The debt of the man who ran when others died. My grandfather lived because he was small, because he was fast, because the mother did not consider him worth the effort. But he knew, every day of his life, that he had left the Lloyds to die. He had left his friends to be harvested, and he swore on his deathbed that if he ever had the chance to repay that debt, he would take it. That was your grandfather's debt, Priya said, not yours. Debt is inherited, Kahlo said. Shame is inherited, and honor can be inherited too. I am here to finish what my grandfather could not finish. I am here to pay the price that he should have paid. And I am here most of all because I know the old songs. I know the rhythms that confuse her. I know the paths that lead her away from the river. You do not know these things. You would run in a straight line and you would die before you reach the water. I can run for hours. I can run in patterns that she cannot predict. I can be the noise that saves your lives. Elias felt tears burning his eyes, hot and shameful, and he hated himself for them. He had known this man for less than 2 weeks. He had paid him money and treated him as an employee, a subordinate, a tool to be used for his own ambitions. And now this man was offering to die for him, offering to sacrifice everything so that Elias might live, and Elias had nothing to offer in return but his worthless tears. Kahlo, he said, his voice breaking, I don't know how to thank you. Do not thank me, Kahlo said sharply. Do not mourn me, just run, just crawl, just survive. That is the only thanks I need. He reached into his shirt and withdrew the small bundle of oilcloth, pressing it into Elias' hand for the second time. The rice wine, the pepper. If you must hide your scent, break the pepper. If you must burn something, use the wine. But do not burn unless you must. Fire draws the young ones. They are drawn to heat the way moths are drawn to flame. Elias closed his fingers around the bundle. It was warm from Kahlo's body, and it felt like the last friendly thing in the world. Go now, Kahlo said. Crawl toward the river. I will give you 10 minutes. 10 minutes to move as far as you can, and then I will run, and then I will shout, and then I will become the noise. He turned away before Elias could respond, before Priya could protest, before the moment could stretch into something that might weaken his resolve. He walked toward the edge of the clearing, his bare feet finding purchase on roots and stones, his body language shifting from the cautious evasion of a prey animal to the deliberate provocation of a challenger. He was preparing himself, Elias realized, transforming himself from a man who wanted to live into a man who was ready to die. We have to go, Priya whispered, tugging at Elias' arm. We have to move now. Elias nodded, his throat too tight for words. He looked at the yellow nest one last time, at the pulsing eggs and the tending hatchlings and the warm glow that seemed to promise shelter and deliver only death. And then he dropped to his belly, spreading his arms and legs wide, and began to crawl. They crawled through undergrowth that tore at their skin, through mud that sucked at their clothes, through spaces so narrow that they had to wriggle like snakes, their faces pressed into the humus, their breath coming in shallow gasps that were barely audible above the ambient noise of the forest. They crawled without rhythm, without pattern, each movement a deliberate act of randomness designed to confuse the sensors that surrounded them. They crawled past tripwires that Kahlo had pointed out, their bellies sliding beneath the filaments, their backs brushing against the lower leaves with a gentleness that was the difference between life and death. And behind them, from the direction of the yellow nest, they heard Kahlo begin to sing. It was not a song in any language that Elias recognized. It was a rhythmic chant, a sequence of sounds that rose and fell and rose again, punctuated by claps and footstomps that were deliberately irregular, deliberately disruptive. Kahlo was creating noise, massive noise, a vibration that traveled through the ground and the roots and the silk in all directions at once. He was shouting, too, words that might have been Baka or might have been something older, something that predated human language, something that spoke directly to the forest itself. "I am here," Kahlo's voice rang out, clear and strong and utterly fearless. "I am the one you want. I am the big one. Come and find me." The response was immediate. The canopy above them exploded with movement, a displacement of air that sent leaves raining down like green snow. Elias heard the silk lines singing, not with the faint vibrations of triggered prey, but with the massive, harmonic oscillations of something huge moving through the web at speed. The mother was coming. She was coming for Kahlo, drawn by the noise and the challenge and the promise of a meal that was larger and more satisfying than the small, crawling things that had been evading her for hours. "Don't look back," Priya gasped, crawling beside him. "Don't look back, don't listen, just crawl." Elias crawled. He crawled with a desperation that tore the skin from his elbows and knees, that shredded his shirt and filled his mouth with dirt and leaves and the taste of his own blood. He crawled past pits that yawned like mouths in the earth, past tripwires that shimmered in the air like ghosts, past the silk highways that carried the news of Kahlo's sacrifice to every corner of the mother's domain. He crawled until his muscles burned and his lungs screamed, and his vision blurred with exhaustion and terror. And behind him, Kahlo's chant became a scream. It was not a scream of pain. It was a scream of defiance, a final, triumphant assertion of will in the face of annihilation. It was followed by a wet, muscular sound, a sound of impact and rapping and lifting, and then by a series of crashes as the mother moved through the canopy with her prize, dragging Kahlo toward the storage sites that awaited him in the hollows beneath the earth. The scream faded, the crashes faded, and then there was silence, a silence that was different from the eerie quiet that had preceded the attacks. This silence was emptier, lonelier, a silence that spoke of absence rather than presence. Kahlo was gone. The mother had taken him, and the garden for a moment was still. "Keep moving," Priya whispered. "She'll be back, she always comes back." They kept moving. They crawled through the final stretch of undergrowth, through a barrier of thorns that left them bleeding and weeping, and then, suddenly, impossibly, they felt a change in the air. The humidity lifted. The temperature dropped. The sound of running water reached their ears, not the drip of condensation but the rush of a current, the unmistakable music of a river. "The river," Elias gasped. We made it to the river." They emerged from the undergrowth onto a bank of smooth stones, the river stretching before them in a ribbon of brown and silver that seemed to Elias like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The water was moving fast, swollen by the rains that had fallen upstream, carrying debris and leaves and the detritus of the forest toward some distant ocean. And on the far bank, visible through the mist that rose from the current, was a clearing. A path, a way out. They had reached the boundary of the mother's web. They had reached the place where her influence ended and the normal world began. They had survived. Elias collapsed onto the stones, his body screaming in 1,000 places, his mind a whirlwind of grief and guilt and relief that was so intense it bordered on madness. He lay there, staring up at the canopy, and wondered if the mother was watching them even now, if her eyes could see this far, if her web extended to the water's edge. "We need to cross," Priya said, crawling up beside him. "We need to get to the other side before she comes back." "I can't," Elias said. "I can't move." "You have to. Kahlo died so you could move. Maya died so you could move. Derek died so you could move. You don't get to stop. You don't get to rest. You crawl across that river, Elias. You crawl across it if it kills you." She was right. He knew she was right. He forced himself to his hands and knees, his muscles protesting with a violence that made him cry out, and began to drag himself toward the water's edge. The stones were smooth and cold and slippery, and the current was strong and the river was wider than it had looked from the bank. But they had to cross. They had to get to the other side. They had to survive. They entered the water together, holding hands, their bodies submerged to their chests, their feet searching for purchase on the rocky bottom. The current tugged at them, pulling them downstream, and they fought it with the last reserves of their strength, inching across the river with a slowness that was maddening. The water was cold, shockingly cold after the tropical heat of the forest, and Elias felt his muscles contracting, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that were almost sobs. And then, when they were halfway across, when the far bank was close enough to touch but the near bank was still within reach, Elias felt it. A tug on his clothing, a slight, almost imperceptible pull on the fabric of his shirt, as though a fish had nibbled at the hem, or a current had caught a loose thread, or something beneath the surface had reached up and touched him with a curiosity that was neither hostile nor friendly but simply interested. He froze. Priya felt his hand go rigid and turned to look at him, her eyes wide with question and fear. "What?" she mouthed. Elias did not answer. He was staring at the water around his chest, at the brown surface that reflected the canopy above in a shattered mosaic of green and gold. He was staring at the place where his shirt disappeared beneath the water, and he was feeling, with a clarity that was more precise than sight, the thing that had touched him. It was not a fish, it was not a current, it was silk. A filament finer than a human hair had wrapped itself around the hem of his shirt. It was not pulling him under. It was not dragging him back. It was simply there, attached, connected, transmitting. The mother had reached the river. Her web had reached the river, and she was still listening. "Go," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible above the rush of the current. "Go now, don't stop, don't look back." They ran the rest of the way, splashing through the shallows, scrambling up the far bank, collapsing onto the mossy earth with a finality that felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. They lay there, gasping, bleeding, weeping, and listened to the river flow behind them, carrying its secrets toward the sea. The sun was setting, the forest was darkening, and somewhere in the heart of the garden the mother was feeding. She was feeding on Kahlo, she was feeding on Maya, she was feeding on Derek, and she was waiting with a patience that was older than human fear for the next crop to arrive. Elias closed his eyes. He slept, and when he woke, the sun was high and the birds were singing, and the world had returned to a semblance of normalcy that was more terrifying than any nightmare could have been. Because he knew, with a certainty that would never leave him, that the garden was still there. The mother was still there, and the web was still growing, still expanding, still waiting for the next visitors to walk into its embrace. The village did not have a name, or if it did, Elias never learned it. It was a collection of mud brick huts and corrugated metal roofs that clung to the banks of the river like barnacles to a ship's hull, home to perhaps 200 people who fished and farmed and traded with the occasional passing boat. They found him on the morning of the third day after his escape, collapsed on a sandbar 2 kilometers downstream from the ridge, his body covered in mud and blood and the accumulated filth of crawling through a nightmare. He did not remember how he had gotten there. He did not remember the river crossing, or the current that had pulled him under, or the moment when Priya's hand had slipped from his, and she had been carried away into the brown water, her last cry swallowed by the rush of the rapids. He remembered only the crawling, the endless, belly-down crawling through undergrowth that tore at his skin and filled his mouth with dirt. He remembered the sensation of silk brushing against his back, of tripwires that he had dodged by millimeters, of pits that yawned beneath him like the mouths of hungry gods. He remembered the sound of the mother's movement in the canopy above, the wet percussion of her legs against the bark, the creak of silk as she adjusted her web to account for his evasion. And he remembered, most of all, the silence that had followed Kahlo's sacrifice, a silence so profound that it had seemed to have weight, to have texture, to press against his eardrums with a physical force. They pulled him from the sandbar with gentle hands, these river people who had seen foreigners before and knew that the jungle sometimes gave them back broken. They wrapped him in blankets that smelled of fish and smoke. They fed him broth that was thin and salty and the most nourishing thing he had ever tasted. They asked him questions in a language he did not understand, and when he could not answer, they did not press. They simply waited, with the patience of people who knew that time was not measured in hours but in seasons, and that some wounds took longer to heal than others. It was a week before Elias could speak, a week of fevered dreams in which the canopy dissolved into a lattice of silk and the ground opened into pits lined with teeth. A week of waking screaming, his hands clawing at the air, his body convinced that it was still crawling, still escaping, still fighting for survival against an enemy that could not be killed, only evaded. The village healer, an old woman with eyes like polished obsidian, treated him with herbs that smelled of camphor and something darker, something that made the dreams recede into a gray distance where they could be observed but not experienced. When the fever broke, Elias found himself in a hut that was barely larger than a closet, lying on a mat of woven reeds, his body covered in bandages that were stained with the yellow-green pus of infected wounds. He tried to sit up, and the world spun, and he vomited into a clay bowl that someone had placed beside his mat with the foresight of long experience. "You are alive," a voice said in French. "That is more than can be said for the others." Elias turned his head, slowly, carefully, and saw a man sitting in the doorway of the hut. He was young, perhaps 20, dressed in a faded Manchester United jersey and jeans that had been patched so many times they were more patched than original fabric. He was holding a satellite phone, its antenna extended, and he was looking at Elias with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite curiosity. "The others," Elias repeated, his voice a rasp that barely qualified as human. "You found them." "We found the big man," the young man said. "The one with the gun. He was in a hole. He was not alive. The animals had found him before we did." Elias closed his eyes. Derek. Of course Derek had been found. The pit traps were not hidden forever. The forest reclaimed everything eventually. "And the woman?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. "The doctor?" The young man shook his head. "We searched the river for 3 days. We found her bag, her medical bag. It was caught in the roots of a tree downstream, but we did not find her. The river does not give back everything it takes." Elias felt the grief hit him then, not as a wave but as a landslide, a crushing weight of guilt and loss that pressed the breath from his lungs and turned his vision white at the edges. Priya. His Priya. The woman who had come to the jungle because she loved him, because she feared for him, because some part of her had still believed that he was worth saving. She had died in the river, swallowed by the current, her body carried away to some unknown destination where the mother would never find her. She had escaped the spider only to be claimed by the water. And Elias had survived, had crawled out, had been pulled from the sandbar by strangers, while she had drifted away into darkness. "The guide," Elias asked, because he had to ask, because the question was a stone in his throat that would not be swallowed. The young man looked away. "There was no guide," he said. "There was only you. You were alone when we found you." Elias nodded, the movement sending fresh waves of dizziness through his skull. Kalo was gone too then, gone into the mother's cache, wrapped in silk and stored for future feeding, his body preserved in the amber embrace of the web. The debt had been paid. The sacrifice had been made. And Elias was the only one left to carry the story, to bear witness, to tell the world what waited in the heart of the Itchery. But who would believe him? The thought came unbidden, a cold whisper that cut through the fog of grief and fever. Who would believe a man who claimed that the Congo was home to a spider the size of a dog, a spider that farmed humans, a spider that had built a web of tripwires and pit traps spanning hundreds of acres? They would call him mad. They would call him traumatized. They would call him a victim of jungle fever and hallucination, and they would file their reports and forget him. Unless he had proof. The rescue boat arrived 3 days later, a motorized dugout that had been chartered by the British Embassy in Kinshasa after Elias' satellite phone call had finally connected. There were 2 men in the boat, both Congolese, both professional and detached, their faces showing no surprise at the sight of the ragged foreigner who was helped into the craft with the careful gentleness of a man who might break. They had supplies, water, antibiotics, energy bars, a change of clothes, and they had questions, endless questions, that Elias answered in monosyllables until they finally gave up and let him rest. The journey downriver took 2 days. Elias spent most of it in a half-conscious state, his body still fighting the infections that had taken root in his wounds, his mind drifting between memory and dream with a fluidity that made both seem equally real. He saw the mother's eyes in the ripples of the water. He heard Kalo's chant in the drone of the outboard motor. He felt Maya's scream in the vibration of the hull against the current. The jungle was behind him, but it was also inside him, and he knew, with a certainty that was deeper than logic, that it would always be inside him. It was on the 2nd day, as the boat rounded a bend in the river and the first signs of civilization began to appear, a fishing village, a rusted truck on the bank, a cell tower rising above the canopy like a steel tree, that Elias felt it. A tug on his clothing. It was slight, almost imperceptible, a gentle pull on the fabric of his shirt that might have been caused by the breeze, or by the movement of the boat, or by the shifting of his own weight against the wooden bench. But Elias knew, with a clarity that bypassed thought and went straight to the ancient, reptilian core of his brain, that it was none of these things. He looked down. His shirt was the same one he had been wearing when the villagers pulled him from the sandbar, washed by the river women but still stained with the memory of mud and blood and fear. And tucked into the waistband, half hidden by the fabric, was something that he had not noticed before. It was a strand of silk, not the thick rope-like silk of the mother's highways, but the fine, almost invisible silk of the tripwires, the sensor lines that had stretched between the trees like a nervous system. It was wrapped around the button of his shirt, looped once, twice, 3 times in a pattern that was too precise to be accidental. It was a connection. It was a tether. It was a message. Elias felt his heart begin to race, and he forced himself to breathe, to remain calm, to not scream or panic or draw attention to himself. The 2 men in the boat were watching the river, not him. They had no idea. They could have no idea. He reached down, his fingers trembling, and touched the silk. It was warm. Warm from his body heat, yes, but also warm in a way that felt alive, that felt organic, that felt connected to something larger and more terrible than he could comprehend. He pulled at it gently, and it stretched, and then it snapped, releasing a faint, almost musical vibration that traveled up his arm and into his chest, where it resonated with a frequency that made his teeth ache. He dropped the silk into the water, watching it float away on the current, a thin filament of pale gold that was swallowed by the brown water in seconds. But the feeling remained, the feeling of being watched, The feeling of being known, the feeling of being connected. It was not until they reached Kinshasa, until he had been checked into a hotel and showered and fed, and given a bottle of whiskey that he did not drink, that Elias examined his gear bag. It was the bag he had carried through the jungle, the waterproof dry bag that had held his camera, his spare batteries, his notebook, his passport. The bag that had been with him every step of the way, through the camp and the ridge and the crawling and the river. The bag that had been slung over his shoulder when he brushed the first tripwire, when he sent the vibration that had started everything. He opened it on the bed, his hands shaking, and dumped the contents onto the stained hotel comforter. The camera was there, its lens cracked, its housing scratched but intact. The batteries were there, corroded by humidity but still recognizable. The notebook was there, its pages warped and water-stained but legible. And beneath the notebook, tucked into a corner where it could not possibly have been placed by accident, was something else. An egg. It was small, no larger than a peanut, exactly the size of the eggs they had found in the leaf nest on the 6th day. It was whitish yellow, slightly translucent, with a texture that reminded him of wet parchment. And it was wrapped in a single strand of silk, a filament so fine that it was almost invisible, that held it in place against the interior wall of the bag with a gentleness that was more obscene than any violence could have been. Elias stared at it for a long time, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The egg could not be here. It was impossible. He had not collected it. He had not placed it in his bag. He had not even seen it since the 6th day, since Maya had found the nest and they had photographed it and moved on. And yet here it was, intact and viable and waiting, tucked into his gear like a gift, like a message, like a seed. He reached for it, his fingers hovering over the shell, and felt the warmth emanating from it. It was alive. Whatever was inside was alive and growing and waiting for the right moment to emerge. "No," Elias whispered, but his voice was weak, and his hand was already closing around the egg, and some part of him, some part that had been damaged by the jungle, some part that had been rewired by fear and survival, was already thinking about the jar he would need, the warmth he would provide, the careful, deliberate cultivation of the thing that was growing inside. He would keep it, he would study it, he would understand it. That was what scientists did, wasn't it? That was what explorers did. They brought back specimens. They brought back knowledge. They brought back the things that the world needed to know, even if the world was not ready to know them. He found a jar in the hotel bathroom, a plastic container that had held complimentary soap, and he transferred the egg into it with a care that was almost tender. He wrapped the jar in his spare shirt and placed it in the bottom of his suitcase, where it would be safe from the jostling of the journey home. And then he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, and listened to the sounds of Kinshasa drifting through the open window. The traffic, the music, the laughter of people who had never been to the Itchery, who had never seen the mother's eyes, who had never felt the vibration of a tripwire singing through their bones. He was alive, he had survived, he had escaped the garden. But the garden, he knew, had not escaped him. It was inside him now, in the egg that pulsed in the jar, in the silk that still clung to his clothes, in the memory of the purple mark that glowed behind his eyelids every time he closed his eyes. The mother had let him go, not because she could not catch him, but because she had no need to. She had given him something better than prey. She had given him a purpose. She had given him a reason to return. The egg would hatch. It would grow. And someday, somewhere, Elias would stand again in a forest that was too silent, and he would feel the vibration of silk against his skin, and he would know that the garden had followed him home. He lay back on the bed, the whiskey untouched on the nightstand, and closed his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids was not empty. It was full of legs and eyes and the patient, terrible intelligence of a farmer who had learned over millions of years that the best prey was the prey that came willingly. The harvest, he knew, was never truly over. It only waited, in jars and suitcases and the quiet corners of human curiosity, for the next season to begin. Outside, the sun set over the Congo River, turning the water the color of dried blood, the color of orchid petals, the color of the mark that pulsed on the mother's underbelly like a heartbeat. And somewhere, deep in the itchery, where the canopy was thick and the silence was absolute, a spider was weaving a new web and waiting and planning and dreaming of the crops that would come. The garden was patient, the garden was eternal, and the garden was always hungry. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories yet to come.